Welcome, dear listener, to another long journey through history, where stories unfold slowly, softly, and in such detail that they carry you away from the noise of the present into the rhythm of the past. And before we begin, I invite you to gently close your eyes. Let your body rest where it is most comfortable. And if you find yourself enjoying these journeys through forgotten times, please consider subscribing to this channel, so you never miss a new story, for every subscription helps keep this calm corner of history alive. And now let us step together into the gilded halls and shadowed chambers of ancient China, where emperors reigned with unmatched power yet carried with them the intimate secrets of desire, ritual, and the burdens of legacy. In the stillness of the Forbidden City at night, when the drums had sounded the curfew and the outer gates closed, the emperor's palace glowed with a faint lantern light, golden silk curtains stirring with the softest breeze, as if the very air inside carried whispers of all who had come before. And in that sacred silence, the truth of the emperor's private world began to unfold, not in the grand audiences of mourning or the ceremonies of harvest, but in the secluded chambers where power met intimacy, and where the emperor's body was considered more than flesh, was a vessel of the empire itself. It is said that in the dynasties of old, from the Han to the Ming and Qing, an emperor's nights were planned as carefully as his wars, for while the empire stretched for thousands of li, his duty also lay within the silken boundaries of his bedchamber. And here the question was not only who shared his company, but how, and with what ritual. For every act of closeness was seen as a balance of yin and yang, the eternal energies that governed all life, and so desire itself was folded into the philosophy of the state, a private moment transformed into an extension of cosmic order. Imagine then the vast palace archives, where ministers and eunuchs recorded not only decrees and taxes, but also the intimate rotations of the harem, the careful scheduling of concubines, and the sacred duty of ensuring that the emperor's lineage would continue. For a dynasty without heirs was a dynasty at risk, and thus every night carried weight beyond pleasure. It was a political act, a ritual act, a moment upon which the fate of the empire could turn. In these chambers, the emperor was surrounded not merely by luxury, but by rules. And here we begin our journey into what intimacy truly meant for a man upon whose shoulders rested heaven's mandate, a man whose every embrace was watched over by traditions centuries old, by attendants unseen in the shadows, and by the expectations of ancestors who demanded continuity. And yet, within this framework, the emperors themselves were still human, with longing, curiosity, and sometimes rebellion against the rituals imposed upon them, and their stories woven through secret scrolls, forbidden texts, and whispered chronicles real to us, a world where power and passion were inseparable, where politics and pleasure met beneath silk canopies, and where the truth of emperors' desires was both majestic and profoundly human. And so as we begin this long tale, let us move slowly through the carved gates of the Forbidden City, past its courtyards bathed in moonlight, past the marble balustrades and guardian lions, into the inner palace, where the emperor awaits, and let us listen with patience to the rhythm of history unfolding, where every detail is a step deeper into the secret world of emperors and the women who lived their lives within these walls. For their stories will carry us through the coming parts, like an endless lantern-lit corridor into the past. And so, as dawn broke over the imperial palace, and the crimson glow of the rising sun spilled across the lacquered tiles, the story of what intimacy meant for Chinese emperors unfolded like a hidden scroll, a narrative passed down in whispers and guarded documents, revealing not only the acts themselves, but the rituals, philosophies, and expectations that governed them. For unlike ordinary men, the emperor's body was seen as an extension of the heavens, and his pleasure was never considered private, but instead a matter of cosmic significance, a union that was said to ensure balance between yin and yang, heaven and earth, fertility and order. And in the quiet hush of those long halls, this responsibility weighed heavily upon every breath and every embrace. The court scholars, steeped in Confucian texts, yet equally aware of Taoist alchemy, instructed that the emperor's encounters with women were not simply indulgences of desire, but orchestrated performances of balance. For it was believed that the emperor must regulate his passion, that he must not give too much of himself, that his essence, his jing, must be preserved, carefully guarded, like a treasury of life. And so manuals and medical texts outlined methods of prolonging intimacy, of drawing out union without surrender, of receiving energy from women while withholding his own. And thus, behind the silken curtains, what seemed like moments of lust were instead calculated exercises, rehearsed and ritualized with the same precision as any state ceremony. The women chosen for these rituals were not mere consorts or fleeting partners. but selected with attention to rank, lineage, and often with ritual timing aligned to the lunar calendar. For Taoist belief held that coupling at certain phases of the moon would draw down celestial energy into the emperor's body, reinforcing his connection to the heavens, and so palace officials, eunuchs, and astrologers busied themselves with charts and records, ensuring that the act of pleasure itself became a kind of cosmic appointment, a private meeting not just between two bodies, but between the Son of Heaven and the stars above. And in this way, intimacy became a ritual of governance, a hidden duty that served the empire itself. And yet, behind these layers of philosophy and ritual, there were the quiet human moments. For the emperor was still a man, and the women who entered his chambers were still women. And though their encounters were cloaked in political symbolism, there must have been laughter, shyness, hesitation, or tenderness that no chronicler dared to record. Moments where the weight of the empire slipped away and what remained was only two people sharing warmth and the dim glow of lanterns. Though history, written with stiff brushstrokes, rarely allowed such fleeting humanity to survive its pages, but the expectations remained strict, and while emperors might have been surrounded by concubines, numbering sometimes in the hundreds or even thousands, the rules of approach, selection, and intimacy were rigidly organized. For eunuchs documented which woman entered his bed, at what hour, and for how long she stayed, all recorded with the precision of court archives, as though each act of intimacy were itself an edict to be preserved. And so the emperor's private life was never truly private, for it unfolded under the watchful gaze of scribes and servants, transforming intimacy into a kind of bureaucratic ritual, where desire was catalogued like state affairs. And as we lean closer into this unfolding story, we begin to see how the emperor's role as the center of the cosmos reshaped what intimacy meant, how power, philosophy, medicine, and ritual blended to create a world where even the most private embrace carried the weight of heaven. And yet, within that weight, there lingers the silent question: what did it truly feel like to live beneath such expectations? To love while being watched, to desire while knowing every moment would be recorded and judged by the court. A question that pulls us further along this path into the veiled chambers of Chinese emperors. The night deepened across the ancient city of Chang'an, that sprawling jewel of the Tang dynasty, where the walls were wide enough for a dozen horsemen to ride abreast, and the streets smelled of roasted chestnuts, perfumed oils, and the faint incense that drifted endlessly from shrines and inside the forbidden palace. The hush of night was pierced only by the low rustle of silks and the whispers of eunuchs whose duty it was to move like shadows, unseen but always present. And in the candlelit chamber of Emperor Xuanzong, the world seemed to exist in another rhythm, slower, heavier, filled with the scent of musk and the faint sound of a guqin played somewhere in the adjoining hall by one of the court musicians, who had been ordered to lull the palace into dreams. Yet inside this chamber the emperor sat with his robes loosened, his eyes glazed with the satisfaction of a man who knew that no pleasure was forbidden to him, for he was the Son of Heaven and the empire itself bent to his desires. In this chamber silk curtains embroidered with golden dragons hung like veils around the imperial bed, and beyond them, women waited, chosen carefully by the eunuchs who understood the ancient duty of balancing the emperor's pleasures with the preservation of his energy. For though he was surrounded by hundreds of concubines, the emperor could not be careless, since in Taoist belief every act of union carried with it a transfer of qi, that vital essence which was said to flow through the body like rivers through the land. And so his advisors had long counseled him to draw from the women without releasing too much of his own vitality, to practice the arts of retention. And thus in the nights of passion within these guarded walls, the emperor learned techniques not only of pleasure but of control, so that what might seem indulgence was in truth ritual, what seemed lust was in fact philosophy turned into flesh. The women who attended him on such nights were not ordinary consorts but carefully instructed partners, who had studied the manuals of the bedroom, artworks passed down secretly from earlier dynasties, scrolls that spoke of the right rhythms, the right breathing, the right pressure of hands and lips. And these women, often the most beautiful among the palace, were expected to guide the emperor into deeper awareness of his own body, while simultaneously offering him delight. And so the chamber became less a place of mere indulgence, and more a living theater of the oldest traditions, where the secrets of Taoist alchemy mingled with sighs of desire, and every embrace was watched over in silence by the eunuchs who waited outside, listening for the bell that would signal the emperor's need or his dismissal. Xuanzong himself, like the emperors before him, carried not only his personal desires into this chamber, but the weight of dynastic expectation, for the emperor's virility was tied to the prosperity of the state, and his ability to produce heirs. To maintain balance, to channel his energy wisely, was considered essential to the stability of the empire, and so his nights were not entirely free but laced with an invisible web of responsibility. For if he overindulged and weakened himself, the court whispered, the state itself might falter, crops might fail, the mandate of heaven might begin to crack. And so while poets outside the palace sang of love and passion, inside these walls sex became something heavier, a duty, a performance, a sacred balancing act upon which the fate of millions might rest. Tonight, as one of his favored consorts approached him, her robe sliding silently to the floor, the emperor raised his hand, not in command, but in subtle ritual, for she knew to stop just short of the bed and bow deeply before the Son of Heaven. And as she rose, the candlelight revealed the powdered smoothness of her face, her eyes lowered in practiced modesty, though within them flickered the knowledge of her role, for she had been taught that her duty was not simply to please, but to assist in preserving the emperor's vitality, to yield yet also to guide, to let him drink from the spring without exhausting himself. And thus she began, not with hurried passion, but with slow gestures, circling, breathing, touching in ways designed to stir but not overwhelm, to bring the emperor into the flow of energy that Taoist masters described as the circulation of heaven and earth within the body. And as she moved with care, the emperor recalled the lessons whispered to him long ago, that to unite with many women was not merely indulgence, but a form of cultivation. For each partner was said to offer a different essence, a unique flavor of ki, and by drawing from many he could strengthen himself, so long as he retained his own seed. And so while outsiders might imagine him as a man drowning in endless pleasure within the palace, the truth was more complex, for each night was choreographed like a sacred play, the timing precise, the breaths counted, the emperor's body trained to hover on the edge of release but rarely surrender, to master the art of possession without loss. And in this mastery lay both pleasure and power. Outside the chamber, in the shadowed halls, the eunuchs kept their careful watch, each one acutely aware that the emperor's health was their responsibility too, for if he weakened, if he fell ill, suspicion would fall upon them, and so they carried small scrolls of instruction, notes on which concubines should be presented, how often, at what intervals, balancing youth and maturity, passion and serenity, so that the emperor's nights were a careful weaving of contrasts designed to maintain his vigor. And thus, what seemed to the world like endless indulgence was in truth an art form, part medicine, part politics, part mystery. But not all emperors had been so careful, and in whispers the eunuchs sometimes spoke of those past rulers who had lost themselves to desire men like Emperor Wu of the Han, who was said to have worn himself down with excess, or Emperor Yang of Sui, who indulged until he was consumed by his own appetites. And these cautionary tales lingered like shadows in Xuanzong's mind, for he knew that though he was the Son of Heaven, he was still a man, and the line between sacred vitality and destructive indulgence was thin, a razor upon which emperors balanced night after night, in the silence of their chambers, with the eyes of history pressing upon them. The Gukan's notes drifted softer now, like falling petals, and the emperor leaned back as his consort joined him their bodies, moving with the slow inevitability of ritual, and in that moment the palace, the empire, the weight of heaven itself seemed far away, replaced only by the rhythm of breath and touch, yet beneath it all there remained that constant awareness that this was not mere pleasure but something larger, something that connected the ruler of the Middle Kingdom to the forces of the cosmos itself. As though in the secret silence of the bedchamber the fate of the empire was written not in ink but in flesh. And so the night stretched long, filled with whispers and sighs, with movements taught by masters whose names had long been forgotten, with rituals that were as old as the dynasty itself. And when at last the candles guttered low and the emperor closed his eyes, he did so not as a man exhausted by pleasure, but as one who had performed his duty, who had walked the narrow bridge between indulgence and cultivation. And the silence that fell over the palace was heavy with the knowledge that tomorrow night, and the next, this delicate dance would begin again, endlessly repeated, endlessly watched, endlessly woven into the story of what sex had truly been like for the emperors of China. The city of Rome lay beneath the glow of torches and the hum of countless voices drifting into the warm night air, and Gaius sat in his shop on the Via Sacra with the parchment unrolled before him, the ink still fresh on his stylus as he tried to capture the weight of stories that pressed against the edges of his memory. Stories of bodies and desires, of whispered vows in the shadow of temples, and of shameless laughter that carried down alleyways where perfumed courtesans leaned against painted doors. And as he wrote, he thought of how the city itself seemed alive, breathing through its people, exhaling sighs of pleasure and cries of longing in every corner, from the palaces of senators to the humble dens of freedmen, because Rome, in truth, was not merely marble and stone, but the heat of flesh, and the stirrings of passion that bound its citizens together in ways law alone could never dictate. And as his stylus scratched across the parchment, he remembered the stories of those who had told him their secrets in confidence, not knowing perhaps that he would one day shape them into tales that stretched beyond their own lives. But he could not help himself, for he believed these stories were the truest record of what Rome was beneath its grandeur. He recalled the memory of a young soldier he had once met in the marketplace, his armor still gleaming from the morning's drill, who had confessed after too much wine that when he returned from campaign he felt more eager to embrace the arms of a lover than to recount his victories, and how he sought comfort in the beds of tavern girls who knew not his name yet held him with tenderness. And Gaius thought this said more about Rome's empire than any map drawn on papyrus, because conquest might fill the Senate's coffers, but it was in the intimate moments of release that men remembered they were alive. And in those moments rank or coin mattered little, for lust reduced all men to the same beating pulse of need. And as Gaius wrote, he could almost hear again the soldier's voice cracking with shame and relief as he spoke of it. A confession that might seem trivial yet carried the gravity of truth that laws and speeches could never match. The hours slipped by unnoticed as lamps burned low, and Gaius found himself carried by another recollection, this one of a matron of noble birth who came to his shop under the pretense of purchasing rare inks, but who lingered too long among the shelves, asking idle questions, her gaze flitting to the door each time footsteps passed. And finally, when no one was near, she admitted that her husband cared more for politics than her body, and that she had found solace in the arms of a household slave whose strength and gentleness gave her the satisfaction denied to her within her marriage bed. And she trembled not with shame but with exhilaration as she whispered her tale. And Gaius remembered how her words pulsed with a dangerous honesty, for in Rome such acts were both common and condemned, hidden behind veils of silence, though everyone knew they occurred. And as he set these details to parchment, he felt again the heat of her presence, the defiance in her tone, the way she embodied Rome's contradictions, chaste in public, unrestrained in secret. He wrote of brothels that stood openly near temples, their doors marked by crude paintings of entwined figures, places where senators could be seen slipping into shadow as easily as sailors returning from port, and how inside the air was heavy with oil lamps and the smell of sweat mixed with perfumes, where men and women alike traded coins for fleeting ecstasies, and where slaves, freedmen, and even citizens sometimes worked side by side, each body becoming an offering to appetite. And he remembered one night stepping too close to such a threshold and hearing the laughter and cries from within, a chorus that seemed to mock the moral strictness of Rome's laws. For though edicts were proclaimed against excess, the city itself throbbed with indulgence. And Gaius in writing sought to capture not the judgment but the reality, for he believed the truth of Rome lay in these contradictions, in the tension between restraint and release. As the moon shifted overhead, he thought of festivals, especially the Floralia, when prostitutes were allowed to perform naked on the stage and flowers rained down upon the crowd, when restraint was abandoned and the city surrendered to revelry. And he described how people spoke of those days with a secret gleam in their eyes, for during the Floralia even the most severe matrons loosened their veils and the lines between status dissolved as the streets became a theater of desire. And he remembered watching from afar as torches lit faces flushed with drink and laughter, men and women moving together without thought of consequence. And he realized how festivals acted as Rome's release valve, moments when the pressures of law and decorum gave way to primal expression. And in those moments the city revealed itself not as an empire of marble, but as a body of flesh and heat, vulnerable, human, and alive. The night deepened, and still he wrote, recalling how slaves often became both confidants and lovers to their masters, how intimacy blurred the boundaries of power, for though law declared that a master owned the body of a slave, in truth passion sometimes inverted the balance, binding the master with need more tightly than the chains binding the servant. And he thought of one story told to him by a free woman who had once been such a slave, who spoke of how her master came to her chamber nightly under the cover of silence, and how she wielded that secret as her own form of power, ensuring her survival and eventual freedom. And though Rome called her property, she had shaped her own destiny through the currency of desire. And Gaius felt compelled to write of it not as scandal but as testimony to the way flesh could challenge the authority of law. As his hand grew weary, he turned his memory to the baths, those great halls of steam and stone where naked bodies mingled without shame, where deals were struck as easily as embraces were exchanged, and he remembered how even the youngest boys in their first visit marveled at the sight of senators and soldiers alike, stripped of their togas, reduced to the common equality of bare skin, and how behind the clouds of vapor, touches and whispers passed unnoticed, and though the baths were celebrated as symbols of Roman hygiene, Gaius knew they were equally temples of desire where the lines between friendship and intimacy blurred, and he remembered once overhearing a merchant laugh as he admitted that more alliances were sealed with embraces in the steam than with signatures in the forum, and Gaius smiled at the memory, for such truths were seldom written, but everyone knew them to be real. The parchment before him now stretched, nearly filled, yet still his mind swelled with recollections, and he allowed the stylus to flow freely, shaping one memory into another, weaving the voices of soldiers, matrons, slaves, courtesans, merchants, and even priests into a tapestry of flesh and longing, and he realized that what he was truly writing was not a chronicle of individuals but the living soul of Rome itself, for in each confession, in each whispered admission of desire, he found the same pulse, the same yearning that made the empire both powerful and fragile, and though stone might crumble and laws might change, the truths of the body endured, binding each generation to the next in an unbroken chain of passion. And as dawn's first light crept through the shutters of his shop, Gaius laid down his stylus and rubbed his weary eyes, the city outside already stirring with the sounds of carts and footsteps, and he knew that though the night's work had filled one scroll, the stories within him were far from exhausted, for Rome itself was inexhaustible, a city whose desires flowed endlessly like the Tiber, and with a slow breath he resolved to continue the work on another night, to keep writing until he had poured into parchment the full truth of the flesh that lived beneath Rome's marble skin. And so the morning after the great feast stretched into the light of day with a heaviness that lingered in the halls of the forbidden city, as the servants carefully rolled away the silk screens to let in the early sun, while the emperor still lay reclined on his vast red-lacquered bed, his mind adrift between dreams and reality, remembering the visions of the night before when dancers had whirled in endless circles, their veils glittering like falling stars, and the wine had loosened every restraint, leaving him with both exhilaration and a hollow ache that nothing in the physical realm seemed to satisfy. For though he had all the pleasures of the empire at his disposal, what he longed for was something deeper, a kind of eternity carved into the moments of passion that came and went like flickering candles in the wind. The eunuchs, ever cautious, tiptoed around the chamber, their eyes cast down as they poured warm water into jade basins, their silence carrying the weight of secrets that they had witnessed 100 times over. For though they were guardians of the emperor's body and dignity, they were also silent recorders of his human weakness, scribbling in their private ledgers of memory things they could never speak aloud, lest their tongues be cut from their mouths. And as they moved with rehearsed efficiency, the emperor stirred, stretching his arms wide as though to embrace the entire room, before summoning with a gesture the attendant who had been trained since boyhood to serve him morning tea infused with crushed ginseng and fragrant lotus petals, a concoction meant to restore vitality after long nights of indulgence. But the emperor's thoughts were already drifting elsewhere, back to the chamber of the concubine Mei-Lien, whose perfumed hair still haunted him with its faint sweetness, and to the whispered words she had dared to speak into his ear when no one else could hear, words of longing, not for power nor for titles, but for the simple warmth of being seen as a man and not as the son of heaven. And that audacity lingered in his mind like a flame refusing to die, because in a world where everyone bowed and praised him as divine, she had touched him with the raw truth of mortal intimacy, stripping away the layers of ceremony and crown, and it was both intoxicating and dangerous. Later that same day, the imperial astrologer was called into the Hall of Supreme Harmony, for no decision in the palace was ever made without consulting the movements of stars and the harmony of elements, and the aged man with his long silver beard and robes stitched with constellations announced that the coming month carried auspicious omens for fertility and expansion of lineage, a declaration that filled the court with subtle excitement, for the emperor's children were not only his personal heirs, but also symbols of cosmic balance, and to increase their number was to strengthen the empire itself, though beneath the surface of this public duty there swirled the hidden competitions of concubines, each hoping to rise above the others by bearing a son who might one day inherit the throne. In the women's quarters, this proclamation spread like wildfire, and the concubines, draped in embroidered silks, began to whisper among themselves, some lighting extra sticks of incense at their private altars, others bribing the eunuchs for better chances at being chosen that night. While Mei Lian sat quietly at her dressing table, her eyes fixed on her reflection in the polished bronze mirror, wondering if the strange mixture of tenderness and rebellion she had shared with the emperor would set her apart or seal her doom, because she knew too well that love in the Forbidden City was as perilous as politics, both capable of raising one to the highest heights or crushing one into dust. Meanwhile, the emperor, restless as ever, walked through the imperial gardens with his hands clasped behind his back. The chrysanthemums blooming in neat rows, their fragrance mingling with the distant splash of koi in marble ponds, and his mind wandered back to stories his tutors had told him as a boy, legends of ancient emperors who were said to command not only armies but also the very essence of yin and yang, balancing the feminine and masculine forces of the cosmos through their nightly unions. Acts of love turned into acts of cosmic governance, and, though he had once dismissed these tales as fanciful, he now wondered if perhaps there was truth in them, if the surge of vitality he felt after certain nights was more than mere desire, if it was the universe itself breathing through him. This idea was encouraged by his physicians, men who combined herbal knowledge with mystical philosophy, for they often spoke of how the emperor's vitality was not just his own but was the breath of the empire, and how the balance of his passions directly influenced the prosperity of the people, which is why they prescribed not only medicines and tonics, but also patterns of lovemaking carefully aligned with lunar cycles, instructing him when to conserve his essence and when to release it, when to favor certain concubines and when to abstain, turning his private chambers into something akin to a temple where pleasure and statecraft intertwined. Yet beneath this web of rituals and rules the emperor remained a man haunted by his own solitude, for though he was surrounded by beauty and servitude, he longed at times for the simplicity of a single heart that sought him not for his crown but for his humanity. And as he paused beneath a blossoming plum tree, watching a petal fall onto the surface of the pond, he felt the stirrings of a melancholy he dared not voice. For emperors were not permitted to be lonely, only divine. That night, when the drums of the watchtower marked the hour, the emperor entered the hall of tranquil splendor where the concubines awaited, their faces painted, their eyes lowered, each a masterpiece of training and artifice. Yet behind every painted face there burned private dreams and fears, and as he passed among them, he could feel the silent weight of their hopes pressing upon him like unseen hands, until he chose with a glance that sealed fate for the evening, and the eunuchs ushered the others away, their silk shoes whispering against the polished floor as they retreated into shadows. Inside the chamber, incense coiled upward like the spirit of desire itself, and the emperor allowed himself once more to be consumed by the eternal game of power, passion, and destiny. Knowing that every embrace was more than a personal indulgence, it was a performance that would ripple outward into history, shaping not only his own life but the fate of the empire, even as he secretly wondered if, in the quiet recesses of his soul, he would ever find the kind of connection that Mei Lian had made him taste, a fleeting intimacy that lingered longer than any perfume. The evening sky above the Forbidden City had turned the color of molten bronze, as the sun sank behind the distant hills, and the tiled roofs caught fire with a fading brilliance that seemed to resist the arrival of night. And inside the hall of earthly tranquility, emperor, when reclined against a pile of embroidered cushions, his mind swirling not with statecraft or reports of the provinces, but with the conversation he had held earlier with Master Gao about the paradox of pleasure and restraint, about how indulgence could weaken the very power that indulgence promised to affirm. And he could not help but feel the sting of truth in those words, for already he sensed in himself the creeping heaviness of indulgence the way nights of ceaseless embraces left his bones aching and his mornings slower to rise, the way whispers in court grew bolder, speaking of an emperor consumed more by flesh than by the vast empire that stretched in every direction beyond these walls. And yet even as such thoughts gnawed at him, the soft rustle of silken robes reached his ears, and the scent of lotus oil entered the chamber before the woman herself appeared. Lady Zan, one of his newer concubines, chosen not by the eunuchs but by Wen's own eyes during a rare walk in the gardens, her beauty less polished than many others, yet imbued with a liveliness that seemed to mock the formality of the court. And as she knelt with an elegance that betrayed no effort and lifted her gaze to him, the emperor felt the tension within him dissolve like ink in water. For here was not a jewel presented for his ownership, but a flame that seemed to dare him to step closer lest he miss its warmth. She spoke little, her words measured with the awareness that every syllable carried weight in this place where whispers could change fates overnight. But her eyes lingered boldly on his, and when found himself recounting to her fragments of his youth, stories of training under tutors, who never smiled of the first time he mounted a horse and nearly fell of the day. His father declared him heir, and though these were tales unworthy of the dragon throne, they felt like treasures in her presence, and her laughter gentle, unforced, was a balm against the suffocating rituals of the day. As they lay together beneath the carved canopy, one wondered if perhaps Master Gao's words had overlooked something. That indulgence, when mindless indeed, drained the spirit. But indulgence, when accompanied by intimacy, by the recognition of one's own humanity mirrored in another, might not be a weakness but a strength. A reminder that emperors were not gods, no matter how much the mandarins and scribes wrote otherwise, but men whose hearts could be warmed by closeness and whose power was only sharpened when rooted in balance. Beyond the private chamber, however, the gears of court intrigue never ceased, and while Wen drifted into sleep, with Lady Jen's hand resting lightly against his chest, in another hall the Grand Eunuch Ming convened a secret gathering of senior attendants, for he had noted the Emperor's growing affection for this new concubine, and feared what unchecked influence she might one day wield. And he remembered all too well how in past reigns women of the inner palace had turned emperors into shadows of themselves, guiding decrees through whispers, securing fortunes for families and sparking jealous rivalries that spilled blood on polished floors. And so he whispered now to his circle that they must act with foresight, not to remove Lady Zen outright, that would risk the Emperor's wrath, but to weave subtle nets around her, to plant rumors that could blossom into doubt, to ensure that her rise never grew unchecked. In the days that followed, the Emperor noticed small shifts, the way some ministers looked at him longer than necessary before speaking, the way Lady Jen's gifts were scrutinized before reaching her quarters, the way other concubines began to feign illness, more often their pale faces framed with damp cloths, as if to remind him of their fragility and need. But Wen was no fool, and he recognized the hand of the eunuchs, though he did not yet know whether to confront them or to let their schemes unravel in silence. For he had learned that emperors who revealed too quickly what they knew only invited deeper plots to form beneath them. Instead, Wen turned his attention to the rituals of the season, for the spring festival approached, and with it the procession of offerings to heaven and earth, a display not only of devotion but of imperial virility. For to bless the land with fertility, the Son of Heaven must himself embody vigor, and so he prepared with fasting and purification, abstaining from the concubines for 7 nights. A trial that gnawed at his patience, but one he bore with a dignity that impressed even the skeptical eunuchs, for they had expected him to falter. And when at last the day came, and Wen led the offerings before the great altar clad in robes, heavy with gold thread and carrying the jade tablet of his authority, the air itself seemed to tremble with the force of his presence, and the whispers of weakness were silenced at least for the moment. Yet when he returned to his private chambers, flushed with the triumph of ritual, he found Lady Zine waiting not with bold laughter but with quiet tears. For during his abstinence she had been tormented by the cruelty of jealous rivals, stripped of attendants, her meals delayed, her silk garments stained with ink poured by unseen hands, and though she had endured with grace, the sight of her sorrow ignited in Wen a fury he had long kept in check. And he swore that he would not allow the inner palace to become a cage of vipers again, not while he drew breath. And so he resolved that night to shift the balance of power, to remind the eunuchs and concubines alike that the Emperor's will was no idle flame, but the steady fire that consumed all who dared forget its heat. That night's vow marked the beginning of a new chapter in Wen's reign, one where indulgence and restraint, affection and authority, would intertwine like silk threads on a loom. For he realized now that to rule was not merely to command armies and sign decrees, but to master the currents of desire within his own walls, to ensure that the intimacy of the bedchamber did not undermine but rather reinforced the majesty of the throne. And as he held Lady Zon close, whispering promises of protection, Wen knew that the nights to come would test not only his strength as a lover, but his wisdom as a sovereign who must keep his empire and his heart in balance. The moon had shifted across the Beijing sky, casting silver light across the tiled roofs of the Forbidden City, where silence stretched like an endless veil, broken only by the faint crackle of lanterns swaying in the night breeze. And within the Emperor's inner quarters, the young scholar Li Wei sat with brush in hand and a scroll unrolled before him, his eyes heavy yet his mind unwilling to rest, for he had been summoned once again to record not the decrees of law nor the victories of campaigns, but the whispers of passion, the catalogue of indulgence, the private life of the Son of Heaven that had to be preserved in guarded words, hidden from the outer court, yet indispensable to the annals of power. And as he dipped his brush into ink, He recalled the events of the past day, which had unfolded with such a mixture of ritual and desire that even his scholar's discipline wavered under the weight of astonishment. He remembered the arrival of the eunuchs who carried trays of jade vessels filled with rare tonics, deer antler ground into fine powder, ginseng roots twisted like dragons, pearls dissolved into liquid, and each offering had been carefully prepared by the imperial physicians, who understood that for the emperor's body to embody strength, his nightly acts must be supported by the science of balance, by the belief that essence spent was life reduced, and so every act of union was followed by remedies, every embrace measured against the tides of ki that flowed unseen but deeply felt. And Li Wei, though young, grasped that here intimacy was never simply flesh meeting flesh, but rather a contest of endurance, a demonstration of vitality, a symbol of celestial harmony between ruler and realm. That evening he had been present at the side chamber when the chosen concubine, delicate yet radiant, was escorted by matrons through corridors, lit by pale lamps, her embroidered robe trailing behind like the petals of a peony in bloom, her face painted lightly so that her beauty shone with an almost unearthly calm, and before she entered the emperor's room she was bathed, perfumed and dressed in silk lighter than mist, while musicians played faint notes on zithers to steady her steps, and Li Wei observed not as a voyeur but as a recorder of ceremony, how every motion was crafted not for romance but for the affirmation of cosmic balance, the belief that the emperor's seed was linked to the fertility of the land itself. When she emerged later, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and pride, the matrons caught her in arms and carried her away to chambers reserved for recovery, and eunuchs entered at once to cleanse the space, to replace sheets with new silk, to sprinkle the air with incense of sandalwood, so that no lingering essence would defile the sanctity of the act. And Li Wei was struck by how quickly the chamber was transformed from a site of raw passion back into an impersonal stage prepared for the next ritual, as though the emperor's intimacy belonged not to him alone but to the rhythm of an entire empire that watched unseen through the machinery of its attendants. Later, when the emperor himself appeared in the hall of heavenly purity for his brief council with astrologers, his face betrayed no sign of fatigue, his robes perfectly arranged, his demeanor serene. Yet Li Wei knew, because he had witnessed it firsthand, that the emperor's heart beat like any man's in the height of embrace, that sweat glistened on his brow as he fulfilled the role expected of him, and yet he carried it all with such grace that none of the court ministers assembled dared imagine the vulnerability that lay hidden beneath the surface of imperial majesty. That night, as Li Wei wrote in his scroll, he found his thoughts wandering from the strict duty of record to the broader meaning of what he had seen, and he wondered how the emperor truly felt. Did he believe these rituals sustained his body and his kingdom, or did he ever yearn for a union, unmeasured by physicians, unobserved by eunuchs, untouched by politics, a union that was simply human, raw and free, or had the weight of the dragon throne crushed even the possibility of such freedom, binding every kiss to the destiny of the realm? The ink bled slightly into the fibers of the paper as his brush moved, and he described how the emperor's every act was guarded by ancient manuals of Taoist wisdom that dictated when to release and when to restrain, how to absorb the yin essence of his partners to strengthen his yang vitality, and how in turn he was believed to pass on cosmic balance to the earth and skies. And Li Wei, though schooled in Confucian texts that valued restraint, could not help but be fascinated by this other body of knowledge that treated desire not as indulgence, but as an essential practice of governance itself. In the days that followed, Li Wei's role deepened, for the emperor began to summon him not only to record, but to read aloud passages from ancient treatises on harmony, and Li Wei would kneel by candlelight, unrolling scrolls of Taoist masters who wrote centuries before of the art of dual cultivation, of men who sought immortality not through steel or war, but through the merging of essences. And as the emperor listened, his face grew contemplative, and Li Wei realized that beneath his imperial authority lay a seeker, a man who wanted to believe that through controlled passion he could extend his reign beyond the mortal span of ordinary kings. One evening, the emperor asked Li Wei quietly, "Do you believe what you read?" And the young scholar, startled, did not answer immediately, for to speak too boldly could invite danger, yet to remain silent would dishonor the trust placed in him. So he lowered his eyes and replied carefully, "The texts are ancient, Majesty, and they carry wisdom that has guided many. Yet whether immortality can be grasped by mortal hands is known only to heaven." And the emperor smiled faintly, neither offended nor satisfied, as if he appreciated the scholar's prudence, while still yearning for certainty that no man could give. From that night onward, Li Wei felt the weight of intimacy not only in the acts he recorded but in the emperor's questions, for here was the most powerful man in the empire revealing his doubts, his longings, his hope that love and desire could be transformed into more than fleeting pleasure, and Li Wei, bound by loyalty and duty, found himself also bound by sympathy, for he saw that behind the robes and rituals the emperor was human, subject to the same hungers, the same fears of aging, the same wish to leave behind a legacy that transcended mere stone and bronze. The air inside the tavern grew heavy as Gaius pressed the sharpened nib of his reed pen against the wax tablet, his hand trembling not from age alone but from the burden of the secrets that his memory forced him to carry across decades, the flickering lamplight casting wavering shadows across the wooden walls, as he began to carve out the memory of that one long-forgotten night when the emperor's court had turned its watchful eye not upon matters of war or trade but upon the desires that lurked beneath the polished marble floors of the Palatine halls, for he remembered the hush of whispers, the veiled glances, the long corridors lit by torches where senators and generals alike slipped into side chambers not to conspire against the state, but to indulge in cravings that could never be spoken aloud in the Senate itself. And he remembered with clarity how the slaves stationed outside those doors had been trained to keep their faces expressionless, their gazes fixed downward, because the punishment for betraying even a glance of what happened behind those doors could be death. Yet those same slaves carried the secrets of Rome in their silence, knowing which mistress lay with which nobleman, which senator sought comfort not in his wife's bed, but in the arms of another man, and which whispers of pleasure could topple reputations far more swiftly than swords. He remembered one evening in particular, when he himself had been sent as a messenger into the inner chambers of the palace, not yet a bookseller but still a boy running errands for his father's patron, and he had seen with his own eyes what few dared to even hint at. The emperor's own courtiers arrayed in masks of painted ivory and gilded bronze, their togas discarded upon couches, their laughter echoing through the chamber like music yet tinged with a sharpness that came from fear, for even those closest to power trembled under its weight. And he remembered the way his own cheeks had burned as he caught sight of senators who hours earlier had stood in the forum declaiming about Roman virtue, now leaning into embraces that violated every speech they had thundered. The contradictions of Rome laid bare in silken sheets and spilled wine, and when he turned to flee, one of the masked figures had seized his wrist with surprising gentleness, a noble woman whose name he never dared to write, her painted lips close to his ear as she whispered, "Remember, boy, history belongs to those who write it, not to those who only watch," before releasing him back into the corridor where his heart raced louder than the echo of his sandals on stone. That whisper had never left him, and now as an old man scratching letters into wax and parchment in his modest shop, he understood. Its weight for to write was to choose what Rome remembered and what it allowed to be forgotten, and he realized that most of Rome's grand tales, the battles, the conquests, the triumphs were but masks themselves, while beneath them lay the raw human hungers that bound slave and senator alike, hungers that senators cloaked in laws and poets cloaked in verses, but which could never truly be banished from the heart of the city. For Rome was not marble and law alone, it was flesh and longing and secrets whispered in taverns, alleyways, and palaces. As he dipped the pen again, he recalled the stories of the women who held power in ways the law never acknowledged. Wives of senators who arranged discreet liaisons with gladiators whose muscles and scars spoke of battles more primal than the Senate could sanction. Courtesans whose influence reached into decisions of war because they whispered counsel to generals in the darkness of the bedchamber. And slaves who became confidants to their mistresses, learning every sigh in secret until they could wield silence itself as a weapon. For in a city where knowledge was power, the knowledge of another's desire was as dangerous as any legion's march. And Gaius wrote of these women not as footnotes but as the pulse of the city, unseen yet vital, for without them half of Rome's true history would vanish into silence. And as he wrote, he remembered to the sacred festivals those moments when Rome's rigid order loosened and the boundaries between class and gender blurred. The nights of Saturnalia when masters served slaves, when women donned the garb of men, when laughter and lust drowned the stern voices of magistrates, and in those nights he had seen senators hiding their faces beneath wreaths, slipping coins into the hands of prostitutes in alleyways, and he had seen matrons, veiled in secrecy, sneak out to meet lovers who waited with trembling hands at the city's edge, and he remembered how the city seemed to breathe differently during those nights, as though the stones themselves sighed in relief, freed from the endless pretense of Roman dignity. and he thought perhaps those nights revealed more truth about Rome than all the marble inscriptions carved by emperors desperate for immortality. Yet memory was not enough, for as his hand ached and his eyes blurred, Gaius realized he must shape the story not only from what he saw but from what he had pieced together from whispers, from gossip carried by traders who drank too much wine in his shop, from old soldiers who returned from campaigns with stories not of battles but of the women and men they had lain with in far-off provinces, describing Egyptian courtesans who painted their skin with oils or Gallic lovers, who spoke in fierce tongues even as they kissed, and he realized Rome had absorbed not just territories but desires, each conquest bringing new flavors of pleasure into the city until Rome itself was less an empire of swords than an empire of appetites, hungry for everything it touched, and this too must be written, for it explained more about Rome than any triumphal arch ever could. The night deepened, and still his pen scraped on, the silence broken only by the faint creak of the shop's wooden beams and the occasional cough that rattled his chest. Yet he pressed on because he felt as though time itself leaned over his shoulder, urging him to finish, as if the city's ghosts feared being lost forever unless his old hand preserved them. And he thought again of the woman in the mask who once whispered to him that history belonged to the writers, and he smiled faintly, knowing that perhaps at last he was doing what she had commanded him to do all those years ago, giving Rome back its truth not in marble or bronze, but in ink and memory, in the soft and fragile lines of stories that might one day outlast even the mightiest stone. And as the morning sun climbed slowly higher over the rooftops of Rome, its light spilling across the tiled eaves and catching in the small cracks of the Via Sacra, Gaius stretched his back as he sat at his workbench with the wax tablets laid open before him, the smell of heated bronze still clinging faintly to the shop, though no forge fire had been lit since the night before. And he thought again of how each story he recorded seemed less like something he was inventing and more like something that had been waiting, suspended in the air of the city itself for a hand willing to inscribe it into permanence. And so his stylus scratched onward long strokes, tracing memories of laughter and whispers in candlelight, of drunken boasts and quiet confessions, and of how power and desire interwove themselves endlessly in the streets of Rome, binding senators and slaves alike into the same current that carried all toward the uncertain tides of history. He remembered as he wrote the tale of an actress named Livia, whose performances in the theaters of Pompeii had once drawn crowds, so great that the streets were choked with people eager for a glimpse of her face painted in vivid pigments, and yet behind the curtain she had been kept by a wealthy patron, not free but bound, her beauty both her liberation and her prison, and Gaius knew that to speak her truth was dangerous. For Rome adored its spectacles, yet punished those who pulled aside the mask. Still he wrote it down, carefully, as though each word carried the weight of her breath from decades before. And then his mind wandered unbidden to the soldiers he had once overheard during a march along the Appian Way, their voices roughened by wine and dust as they spoke of women in distant provinces, of temples plundered and promises broken, their laughter masking the hollowness that always followed conquest. And Gaius felt again the strangeness of it, that Rome's might was so celebrated, and yet each soldier was still a man, hungry, frightened, yearning for touch in the night, whether it came from a tavern girl in Antioch or a stolen kiss behind the barracks near the Tiber. As the city stirred beyond his doorway, the sound of merchants arranging their goods and children calling to one another in playful defiance, Gaius's pen drifted into another story, this one of a senator whose name he dared not inscribe, for the man still lived, yet whose nightly indulgences were whispered from brothel to bathhouse, a man who passed laws about morality while secretly summoning dancers to his villa, men and women alike, dressed as gods and goddesses, to reenact the myths of Olympus in flesh beneath flickering torches. And Gaius felt his own cheeks flush as he wrote of it, though not from shame but from the sheer absurdity of Rome's duplicity. The same city that demanded virtue and yet thrived on decadence. The hours bled together in long, unbroken thought as he continued, his stylus moving almost of its own accord, describing how in the Subura district, where the narrow alleys twisted like veins, there were midwives who served both as healers and as keepers of secrets, women who knew which herbs could stoke passion and which could cool it, who whispered charms over young brides trembling with uncertainty, and who alone carried the burden of silenced stories, for when a senator's daughter sought them in secrecy, they said nothing, and when a slave begged for relief from the consequences of a forced encounter, they said nothing still, except to mix powders and hope the gods would forgive what society would not. He thought too of the temples, so gilded and solemn by day, yet by night often filled with quiet meetings, for devotion to the gods was not separate from the hungers of the flesh. and in the shadows of columns offerings were sometimes not only of coin or oil but of touch, worshippers pressing themselves into one another with prayers on their lips, hoping Venus would bless them, or Priapus would spare their mockery. And Gaius knew that such things were rarely spoken aloud, but were as much a part of Roman religion as incense or sacrifice. By the time the sun reached its peak overhead, the clamor of the forum echoing with shouts of sellers and orators, Gaius's wax tablets were already filled with lines upon lines of these recollections, and he leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow, realizing that his role had shifted, that he was no longer merely a craftsman repairing worn trinkets, but had become something else. Entirely a guardian of memory, a vessel for truth's Rome itself would rather leave scattered like dust in its streets, and though he feared what might happen if the wrong eyes ever read his words, he could not stop. For the stories demanded to live, and in their telling he felt the pulse of the city itself alive, restless and eternal. The night had deepened across the ancient city, and the quiet streets of Rome seemed to breathe with a life of their own. As the air carried the scent of oil, lamps burning low, the faint lingering aroma of bread cooling in clay ovens, and the occasional whisper of footsteps echoing along the paving stones of the Via Sacra, where Gaius walked slowly after closing his small shop, his mind still racing with the weight of the stories he had begun to record earlier that day. Stories that seemed to demand his attention more insistently with each passing moment, as if the city itself had chosen him to preserve the hidden truths of Roman life before they slipped into silence forever. He felt a strange heaviness in his chest, as he thought of the way people passed by him daily without realizing that beneath their public lives lay entire hidden worlds of desire, longing, power, and shame, all woven together like the threads of a tapestry that was only visible when one dared to look close enough. And though he was but a humble craftsman by trade, Gaius now felt like a keeper of something greater, a chronicler of the very pulse of Rome that no senator's decree or imperial inscription could capture. Passing beneath the looming shadow of the Basilica Julia, he thought of the courtesans who leaned against its walls by dusk, waiting for clients who pretended a dignity in daylight, but sought escape in the dark, and he remembered the conversations he had overheard near the markets where older women told young wives that the key to keeping a husband lay not only in managing his household, but also in knowing how to keep him bound with pleasures whispered about behind closed doors, secrets never carved into marble but spoken softly from mouth to ear, generation to generation to generation. That night he did not go straight home but wandered toward the Subura, where the narrow streets twisted into a labyrinth of taverns, brothels, and cramped insulae, and though it was a district shunned by senators and patricians, it was alive with the raw hum of Rome's heart, filled with smells of spiced wine, roasted meat, and the faint acrid sting of cheap perfumes, mingling in the air. And as Gaius observed the flickering lamps above doorways marked with painted symbols of Venus, he realized that here, more than in any forum, debate, or temple ritual, the reality of Roman intimacy could be witnessed plainly stripped of pretense. He stopped near a tavern where laughter spilled out into the street, along with the sound of a flute, and leaning against the doorway he saw sailors carousing with women whose painted cheeks shone in the lamplight, their laughter edged with both invitation and exhaustion, and he could not help but wonder how many of these women had once been wives abandoned or daughters, sold into survival, their bodies, now their currency, in a city where pleasure was as much a trade as pottery or grain. His eyes lingered on one woman with dark curls tied loosely at the back of her neck, who leaned in to whisper something into a man's ear, and though Gaius could not hear her words, he could see the way the man's face flushed, as if her voice itself had carried the promise of something both forbidden and irresistible. And in that moment Gaius understood that these women were not merely sellers of the flesh but artisans of allure, skilled in a craft that wielded power as surely as any politician's speech. Moving deeper into the district, he came across a small shrine dedicated to Priapus, the god of fertility, his crude image painted boldly on the wall, reminding all who passed of the city's unashamed celebration of desire. And nearby, in the shadows of the shrine, a group of young men whispered among themselves about their first visits to a brothel, their voices betraying a mixture of bravado and nervousness as they compared what they had seen, what they had touched, and what they hoped to experience, their words echoing the eternal curiosity of youth that no empire, no matter how vast, could ever contain. As Gaius listened unseen, he felt a pang of recognition, remembering his own youthful nights when curiosity had drawn him to such places, when the world seemed both frightening and irresistible, and he realized that the cycle of desire and discovery was the true rhythm of Rome, a rhythm that would beat on long after his own life faded. At last, when the night grew heavy and the torches burned Lo, he returned to his modest home, where he lit a small lamp and unrolled the wax tablets he had been filling with his writings, and as the flame flickered across his tired face, he began to carve again with his stylus, determined to preserve not just the grand spectacles of emperors and wars, but the intimate truths of ordinary Romans, the quiet whispers, the hidden laughter, the private sorrows, the stolen touches in the dark. He wrote of the women of the Subura, of the wives who shared secrets in hushed tones, of the slaves who learned to wield intimacy as survival, of the youths who discovered themselves in the painted rooms of brothels, and of the husbands and wives whose public dignity masked private complexities. And as he wrote, his words seemed to flow faster than his hand could carve, as though the city itself was dictating to him, pressing its heartbeat into his memory. Hours passed unnoticed until his lamp sputtered low, yet still he wrote, weaving together the fragments of voices he had heard and sights he had witnessed, until the wax was filled with impressions of a Rome that few would dare to acknowledge, but all had lived in some way. And when at last his hand stilled, he looked at the tablets and felt a strange peace, for he knew he had captured a piece of eternity in them, not the eternity of monuments or triumphs, but of human truth that would never fade. And so, as dawn began to creep once more across the rooftops of the eternal city, painting the sky with the pale promise of a new day, Gaius sat quietly in his little home, the weight of Rome's untold stories resting in his hands, and he knew that though he was but one man in a vast city, he had become the keeper of its most fragile, most intimate legacy, a legacy that whispered not of empires rising and falling, but of the eternal flame of desire that burned in every heart, unchanging, unbroken, and as old as Rome itself. The streets of Rome grew quieter as dusk settled over the city, and Gaius, still seated behind the counter of his little shop along the Via Sacra, listened to the fading footsteps of citizens hurrying home, while torchbearers began to light the oil lamps that cast golden halos upon the ancient stones. And as the shadows stretched long, he dipped his reed pen back into the inkwell and let the tip bleed black against the parchment where he had been writing for hours, his wrist aching yet his heart strangely light because he felt he had become more than a merchant today. He had become a preserver of memories, a witness of stories that might have otherwise been lost to the dust of time. And so he began again, the steady strokes of his hand, weaving into words a tale that came to him as vividly as if he were standing in the midst of it. And this one was not of emperors or generals or gladiators, but of an ordinary man, a baker whose life reflected the quiet passions of Rome that history's great chroniclers rarely thought to record. This baker, Marcus Livius, had risen before dawn each day for 30 years to heat his oven and knead his dough, and though he was known for bread that crackled in the mouth and smelled of warm grain and smoke, his story was not only about food, but about how love and desire wrapped themselves into the humblest lives. For Marcus had married a woman named Flavia who came to him not from a noble house but from the noisy stalls of the market, where she once sold figs, and though her hands were rough and her laughter loud, she had an allure that made men turn their heads as they passed. Yet she chose Marcus because he spoke to her gently and promised her not riches but constancy, and in the small rooms above the bakery, their marriage unfolded in rhythms as steady as the kneading of dough. But Gaius did not pause there, for he knew that behind the bakery's shutters there were whispered things, the sort of intimacies that revealed what Roman love was truly like for common folk. And he wrote of how Flavia, curious and bold, would sometimes tease her husband into letting her taste not only the sweets of his oven but the forbidden thrill of games between the sheets, and how Marcus, though a simple man, learned to please her with tenderness rather than the roughness boasted of by soldiers and sailors. And so their home became a place where desire was not only an act of the body, but a ritual of trust, the kind of trust that kept their union alive long after youthful beauty had faded, and the marketplace no longer rang with Flavia's laughter. Gaius dipped his pen again, his eyes glimmering in the lamplight, and he carried Marcus and Flavia's story into the years when their children grew and married, when grandchildren clambered up the stairs smelling of flour and smoke, and how still in the quiet of the night, when the city slept, the old baker and his wife found comfort in each other, proof that Roman passion was not only the domain of the young or the mighty, but could endure in simple hearts as stubbornly as a flame that refuses to die. Yet, as Gaius wrote, he felt the pull of another memory, one told to him long ago by a traveler who had stopped for wine in his shop, a tale not of love within marriage but of temptation beyond it. And so he shifted his parchment and began anew, tracing the outlines of a woman called Aemilia, the wife of a senator who lived in a house where marble columns rose like trees and painted frescoes shone with colors that only the wealthy could afford. Yet despite her riches, Aemilia was restless, for her husband, devoted to politics and ambition, rarely touched her hand or looked into her eyes. And she, young and unfulfilled, wandered the gardens at night beneath the moon's gaze, and there met a Greek tutor hired to teach her children. The tutor Callias had eyes dark as olives and a voice that carried the rhythm of poetry, and Aramelia, who had once been taught that Roman women must be silent and dutiful, discovered in his presence a hunger she could not deny, and so she found excuses to linger near him, to ask about Homer and Sappho, and though their words were innocent at first, the air between them thickened until even the silence seemed charged with unspoken promises. And when at last they touched, it was not in the frenzy of lust, but in the trembling wonder of two souls who had longed for tenderness and found it in secret. But Gaius did not shy away from writing the risks of their affair. For in Rome, adultery was both a private scandal and a public crime, punishable by exile or worse. And so Aemilia and Callias became masters of concealment, weaving their love into the margins of her life. A stolen glance at dinner, a brush of the hand as he passed her scroll, a hurried embrace in the shadowed colonnade while the household slept, and though danger pressed upon them, the sweetness of their forbidden union only deepened, for such was the paradox of Roman desire. It thrived as much in risk as in devotion, and as he wrote, Gaius thought of how strange it was that Rome, a city of laws and gods, a city that demanded duty and restraint, was also a city alive with secret passions, with whispered names in the dark, with laughter muffled behind doors, with bodies finding one another in courtyards, taverns, temples, and fields. And he realized that the story of Rome was not only the story of emperors building monuments or legions, marching to conquest, but also of ordinary men and women seeking warmth in each other's arms, sometimes faithfully, sometimes recklessly, yet always humanly. The night outside deepened, the lamps flickered low, and Gaius felt his own eyelids grow heavy. But he forced himself onward, scratching out more tales on the parchment, for he feared that if he did not trap these memories on paper they would vanish like smoke. And so he told of dancers who performed at feasts, their bodies draped in silks that shimmered like water as they moved, and of how men and women alike watched with flushed cheeks, some thinking of beauty as art, others as invitation. And he wrote of soldiers returning from campaigns who carried not only spoils of war but lovers from foreign lands, their tongues clumsy yet their embraces fierce, weaving new threads into Rome's fabric of desire. And finally, as the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in his shutters, Gaius set down his pen and gazed at the pile of parchment before him, pages heavy with ink and memory, and he whispered to himself that though he was only a shopkeeper with no fame and no title, perhaps one day someone would read these stories and understand that Rome beneath all its marble and steel was made of flesh and longing, and that in the hearts of its people, whether bakers or senators' wives, the truth of love and passion had always burned as fiercely as any empire's flame. The city was quiet that morning in a way that unnerved even those who had grown used to its rhythm, for the sounds of merchants calling out their wares, the hammering of smiths, the clatter of carts, and the shrill laughter of children chasing each other through alleyways, all seemed somehow subdued, as though the very air had grown heavier with the weight of unseen eyes watching from the high walls and the distant hills. And as Gaius walked slowly down the Via Sacra with a tablet tucked under his arm and his thoughts clouded with the remnants of restless dreams, he could feel that same heaviness pressed against his chest, as though fate itself were reminding him that peace in Rome was never more than an illusion, a veil draped over simmering fires that could at any moment erupt into chaos. He had spent the night recording the memories of the courtesans, the gladiators, the old senators who spoke with bitterness about how the Republic's virtues had been sold for bread and spectacle, and though his wax tablet bore only a fraction of the words spoken in hushed voices and half-drunk confessions, his mind carried them all like a burden he could neither cast off nor ignore, because every detail of lust, betrayal, and ambition intertwined with the greater truth that Rome itself was built on appetites that could never be satisfied, not by victory, not by conquest, not by gods themselves, but only by consuming more until nothing was left but ash. As he walked, he passed beneath the looming shadow of the Temple of Venus, and Roma, where a priestess was sweeping the marble steps, her bare feet moving silently over the cold stone, and though she seemed intent on her work, she glanced up at him with eyes that were far too knowing for a simple servant of the goddess, eyes that made him wonder if she too carried stories unfit for public hearing, stories of secret rites conducted when the city slept, when torches flickered behind closed doors and chanting rose like smoke into the night sky, carrying prayers not to Venus, the mother of love, but to darker spirits who promised pleasures that left scars on the soul. The thought lingered with him as he entered his workshop, lighting a small oil lamp and unrolling the scrolls. He had already filled with carefully etched words, and he noticed how the flames cast long shadows that danced across the walls, twisting like restless figures from the memories he had captured, slaves trembling in candlelit chambers, senators clutching at forbidden lovers, matrons whispering confessions between sips of wine. And he realized that in telling these stories he had become less a scribe and more a vessel, carrying Rome's hidden truth from one night into another. Until one day perhaps someone far beyond his lifetime might read and understand that this empire had not been built only by legions and laws, but also by desire, secrecy, and the endless hunger of human hearts. Yet even as he thought of this, the sound of hurried footsteps broke the silence, and a young boy burst through the doorway, panting, eyes wide, clutching a sealed letter in his hand. The wax marked with a crest. Gaius recognized instantly Marcus Aelius, one of the wealthiest men in the city. A patron whose influence reached from the Palatine Hill to the docks of Ostia, and whose appetites were whispered about more than any gladiator's victories or emperor's decrees. For Marcus was said to hold gatherings where the line between ritual and excess blurred into something dangerous, something even Rome's tolerant society dared not speak of too openly. The letter trembled in Gaius's hand as he broke the seal and read the elegant script that invited no commanded him to attend that evening's gathering at Marcus's villa beyond the Avon, where he was told he would hear truths spoken aloud that no wax tablet could ever fully capture. And though every instinct warned him of the risk, he knew that refusing such an invitation was as dangerous as accepting it. For men like Marcus did not forgive easily, and curiosity burned in him like fire, for if even half the rumors were true, then he would be stepping into a world where desire and power mingled in ways that could either enlighten or destroy him. That evening, when the sun sank into crimson haze over the Tiber, Gaius wrapped himself in a simple cloak and made his way toward the villa, passing through narrow streets that seemed to grow darker with every turn, until he reached the great bronze gates that opened with a groan, revealing gardens lit with torches and perfumed with exotic flowers, their scents heavy and intoxicating, masking the faint odor of smoke and sweat that clung to the air. And servants guided him silently through marble corridors into a vast chamber where men and women reclined on couches draped in silk, their eyes gleaming with the hunger of wolves disguised as nobles. At the center of the room stood Marcus himself, tall, broad-shouldered, his toga pure white except for the deep, crimson stripe that marked his senatorial rank, his hair streaked with silver, though his face held the vigor of a man still dangerous. And when he raised his hand, the chamber fell into silence, the whispers fading into expectant hush, as though everyone there waited for something greater than feasting, greater even than fleshly indulgence. And Marcus's voice, deep and steady, carried across the hall as he spoke of Rome not as it was, but as it might become, a city of gods, walking among men, a place where pleasure was worship, where boundaries of law and morality dissolved like wax under flame, leaving only the raw truth of human desire. The words seemed to bind the audience in spell, and Gaius watched as servants entered bearing trays of fruit and wine, as dancers moved with languid grace, their bodies painted with symbols that were older than Rome itself, spirals and lines that whispered of cults from the east, from lands beyond the Euphrates where mysteries were guarded by fire and blood. And he realized that Marcus's gatherings were more than indulgence, they were theater, ritual, initiation into something that promised power not through conquest but through surrender to the very forces most men feared. And as the night deepened, the air thick with incense and murmurs, Marcus beckoned Gaius closer, pressing into his hand a small object, a carved amulet of ivory shaped like entwined figures, male and female, yet not quite human, their limbs twisting into one another so completely that beginning and end could not be told apart. And Marcus leaned close, whispering that to understand Rome, truly understand her heart, one had to look not at her temples or her senate, but at her bedchambers, her festivals, her hidden rites, for it was there, in passion and secrecy, that the empire drew its strength and sealed its doom. Gaius felt the weight of those words sink into him like chains, for he knew he could no longer turn away, but his task was no longer just to record but to bear witness. To follow the story, no matter how deep into shadow it led. And as he tucked the amulet into his cloak and glanced around the chamber where laughter rose and bodies pressed close in a haze of wine and desire, he understood that he was standing at the threshold of something vast and perilous, a truth that could devour him as easily as it revealed itself. And yet he felt no fear, only the steady pull of inevitability, as though he too had been chosen by Rome's restless hunger to carry her secret history forward into the night. The streets of Rome had fallen into that strange silence that came only in the final hours of the night when the taverns had closed, when even the lamp sellers and the dice players had wandered home or collapsed drunk against a wall, when the city itself seemed to be holding its breath before the first carts of bread-makers began to roll out toward the forum. And it was in that silence that Gaius sat with his wax tablets laid across the counter of his little shop, the stylus scratching slow and steady lines as he tried to capture on the smooth surface the voices that still rang in his mind from the gatherings and whispered stories of the previous days. For he had come to understand that if he did not fix them here and now, they would fade into the air and be lost, carried away like the smoke from the lamps that guttered beside him. He remembered the freedwoman who had stood in the atrium of her patroness' villa with her head bowed, yet her eyes unflinching as she described the secret liaisons that slipped through the house like shadows, while her master dined with senators the way slaves arrange signals with folded garments and open shutters, the way desire slipped silently beneath the skin of order. And as he wrote it all down, he could almost hear again the tremor of her voice as she admitted that in such houses the boundaries of power and flesh were never clear. From there his thoughts drifted to the tale of the veteran soldier who had come back scarred from campaigns in Germania and who, drunk on sour wine in the corner of a dim tavern, had spoken of the women of the camps, of how they had followed the legions not as mere wives, but as traders, healers, and comforters, how tents became not just places of sleep, but little worlds of longing and release, and how even in the coldest mud desire warmed men better than fires could. And as Gaius wrote, he felt again the deep weight of the soldier's words heavy with years and dust. He paused and lifted the stylus, staring into the faint glow of the oil lamp, and thought of how these stories formed a tapestry richer than any mosaic in the bathhouses, each voice adding a fragment, a tile, a shimmer of truth about Rome, not in marble or law, but in the private hunger of its people, in the way that flesh and longing shaped lives as surely as politics and conquest did. And he knew this was the Rome he wanted to preserve, the Rome that lived in whispers. And so he bent once more over the tablets and recalled the merchantess' daughter who had spoken with such candor about her marriage negotiations, the way her father measured her beauty in terms of dowry and alliances, the way her suitors spoke not of her laughter or wit, but of land and vineyards. Yet behind it all she had confessed that she had already given her heart to a young poet who walked with her at dusk by the river, and in her defiance Gaius had felt both the cruelty of custom and the rebellion of passion. And he carved her words carefully into the wax, as though they themselves were treasures. The night thickened outside, the noises of drunks and stray dogs fading until only the occasional creak of wood or faint rush of the Tiber could be heard. And still Gaius wrote, pressing each story into the surface until the wax carried the weight of half a dozen lives, until his shop felt less like a merchantess place and more like a hidden archive of the city's soul. And in that act he felt a strange calm, as if by gathering these voices he was resisting the great silence that time would otherwise impose on them. Yet as he wrote, another memory returned, one that unsettled him more than the others, the night he had been led into the garden of a senator's house where ivy curled around marble statues and where he had overheard women speak of rituals held far from public eyes. Rituals in which masks and incense blurred the line between the sacred and the forbidden, in which the body became both temple and offering. And though he had not seen all that they described, he had felt the fire of their words burning long after he left, and now, trying to etch them into wax, he found his hand trembling, the lamp hissed softly, the wick drowning in its pool of oil, and Gaius sat back, shoulders aching, staring at the lines he had pressed into the tablets, and he wondered how long he could keep this work secret, how long before someone asked why a humble shopkeeper spent so many nights writing when others slept, and whether these words, if ever found, would be seen as harmless curiosities or dangerous truths that revealed too much about the hidden life of Rome. But still, he wrote, for the urge to preserve outweighed the fear, and as dawn finally brushed pale light against the edge of his shutters, he pressed one final sentence into the wax, one that seemed to rise not from his memory but from the city itself, that beneath the marble and the power, Rome was a city of whispers, and those whispers, if ignored, would vanish like dust. And as he closed the tablets and hid them beneath the counter before the first customer of the day could arrive, Gaius felt both exhausted and alive, for he carried within him not just the stories of others, but the certainty that he was now their keeper, that through him their voices would endure even when the streets fell silent again. And so the days stretched onward in the city of Rome, where marble gleamed beneath the sun, and shadows crept through the narrow alleys at dusk, and Gaius, the scribe, continued his quiet work within his modest shop on the Via Sacra, carefully scratching his stylus across wax and then ink across parchment as the voices of the past poured forth into his hands like a river that would not cease for every day. New faces arrived at his counter with whispers and confessions, and tales half forgotten, asking him to preserve them before they slipped away into the silence of time. And Gaius felt both the weight of the task and the strange serenity of knowing he had become the keeper of a secret. Chronicle of Rome, not the kind preserved by senators or inscribed in triumphal arches, but the hidden one carried in the chambers of lovers and the shadows of taverns and the matrons behind their shutters. He wrote of the gladiator who sold his strength not only in the arena but in private contracts with noblewomen who craved his dangerous presence, and of the senator's daughter who disguised herself as a slave to sneak into the Subura and taste the forbidden pleasures of the lower classes, and of the Greek tutor who turned lessons of philosophy into lessons of the body with eager pupils, who sought more than wisdom. And as he wrote, Gaius began to see a pattern in all the fragments, a single woven tapestry of desire and secrecy and longing that stretched across all of Rome, uniting rich and poor in the same restless hunger, though each clothed it in different masks, one gilded in gold and another veiled in dust. One afternoon, as the light poured golden through the shutters, he heard the soft rap of knuckles on the door, and when he looked up, he saw a woman draped in deep blue wool, her veil pulled low, yet her eyes flashing with urgency as she stepped inside without waiting for invitation. And when she lowered her veil, Gaius recognized her as Flavia Domitilla, a name whispered with both reverence and danger, for she was connected by blood to the imperial family itself, and yet here she stood in his small writing shop clutching a folded scrap of parchment as though it were aflame in her hands. And when she spoke, her voice was low and hurried, telling him she needed a story preserved but never to be spoken until after her death. A story of betrayal within the walls of power, where lust had driven choices that could unmake alliances and topple households. She told him of a banquet in the Palatine Palace, where the music of lyres had floated over fountains, and the air smelled of roses and roasted peacock, yet beneath the laughter of senators and generals darker games had played out, for she had seen with her own eyes the Empress herself slipping away into the moonlit colonnade, where a young Praetorian guard awaited, trembling yet defiant, and what transpired between them was not the embrace of a servant obeying command, but the urgent kiss of two equals, risking ruin for forbidden love. And Flavia whispered that if such knowledge ever emerged it could shake the throne itself, and so she demanded that Gaius record it carefully, and hide it among the other stories, for time would decide whether it should ever surface. As Gaius inscribed her tale, he felt the chill of danger creep along his spine, for he knew that to hold such secrets was to cradle fire, and yet he did not stop, for something within him hungered to preserve truth, no matter how perilous, as though Rome itself had chosen him to be the vessel of its hidden pulse. And when Flavia departed, she left behind not only the scent of her perfume, but also the unmistakable sense that greater storms lay ahead. The next evening Gaius wandered through the Subura, listening to the sounds of taverns and bathhouses, where laughter mingled with moans and dice rattled across wooden tables, and in one smoky corner he overheard sailors speaking of a strange ritual they had witnessed in Ostia, a gathering of merchants and courtesans who by torchlight reenacted the loves of the gods, themselves with masks of Venus and Mars and drunken songs of passion and punishment. And he thought how often Romans blurred the lines between sacred and profane, turning temples into stages and bedrooms into shrines until the boundaries were impossible to trace. Night after night he returned to his desk, and the pages grew heavy with ink as he recorded not only confessions but his own reflections that perhaps the true Rome was not carved in stone nor written in decrees, but lived in the secret hours, when masks fell away and every citizen, noble or slave, surrendered to the same elemental hunger, and it was in those hours that the empire revealed itself not as marble but as flesh. One late night, when the moon hung low and the streets were hushed, he heard footsteps at his door, and when he opened it, there stood Marcus again, the former gladiator whose life Gaius had once preserved in words, though Marcus now bore new scars across his shoulders and eyes, more weary than before, and he said he had returned from the provinces, where he had been hired to guard caravans, yet even their desire had followed him, for the wife of a wealthy merchant had made him her secret companion, and when her husband discovered it, Marcus barely escaped with his life, and now he sought to have his story written not for glory, but so that he might not be forgotten should the sword finally claim him one day. Gaius welcomed him in, and as Marcus spoke of nights beneath foreign stars, where passion burned hotter than campfires, and mornings when shame pressed heavier than armor, the scribe realized that Rome's reach extended not only across lands, but also into the very veins of its people, for no matter where Romans went, they carried with them this restless mixture of conquest and craving, binding empire and desire into the same endless march. So the chronicle grew heavier still, and Gaius sometimes wondered if the gods watched from Olympus, amused at mortals who believed themselves free, when in truth they were all bound by the same chains of longing and secrecy. Yet he kept writing, because to stop would be to silence the very heartbeat of Rome, and he knew the day would come when his scrolls would be discovered and perhaps judged. But until then he would remain the unseen historian of passion, the one who recorded what others dared only to whisper in the dark. The next morning arrived with a kind of silence that felt different from the usual hum of the city, for while the Forum Romanum stirred with voices rising like distant waves, and the clang of hammers already echoed from workshops along the Subura, the air itself seemed heavy, as if Rome had paused between breaths, and as Gaius stepped from the threshold of his little shop onto the cobbled Via Sacra, he noticed the peculiar hush of passers-by, whose eyes darted quickly away from one another, their mouths pressed into thin lines that betrayed both unease and the reluctance to speak aloud what troubled them. He began walking toward the Forum, his wax tablets clutched beneath his arm, because he had promised himself the night before that he would continue recording stories not only of the intimate lives of Romans, but also of the moods that swept through the city like invisible tides. And as he moved he passed a group of women bent low over amphorae, filling them from a fountain whose trickle of water gleamed in the early sun. And he overheard one whisper to another that an omen had been seen the night before. Some said lightning had struck the temple roof of Juno. Others swore a she-wolf had howled at the very steps of the Senate. Superstition clung to Rome as tightly as ivy to its ancient stones, and as Gaius wove through the crowd he realized how quickly such whispers became a part of the collective story. For here was a merchant shaking his head with the weight of worry there, a soldier muttering that perhaps Mars himself demanded more sacrifices, and everywhere faces tense with the suggestion that the gods had grown restless with the city's excesses. It occurred to Gaius that in the tales he had been gathering the feasts where laughter drowned in wine, the private chambers where desires slipped free of restraint, the alleys where flesh was traded like grain, there was a common thread of daring that perhaps the gods, if they indeed gazed upon mortal affairs, might regard with envy or disdain, and he wondered if these supposed omens were not merely mirrors reflecting the city's own guilty conscience. He stopped near the Basilica Julia, where clerks were already arranging tablets across benches, their voices sharp as they called out names for trials that would unfold through the day. And leaning against a column he began scratching into wax. What he observed, noting not only the cases, but the postures of the men awaiting judgment, some trembling, some defiant, some whispering hurried prayers under their breath, as though Jupiter himself might intervene if properly petitioned. And then a hand touched his shoulder and he turned to see Lucius, his old friend who often walked with him during these wanderings, and Lucius's brow was furrowed deeper than usual, his eyes scanning the Forum before he even spoke, and when he did his voice was low, saying that the whispers of omens were not the only thing stirring fear. For last night a senator had been found dead in his villa on the eventing, his body discovered with strange markings carved into his flesh, and though officials hushed the matter, rumor spread like wildfire that the man had dabbled in forbidden rites. The thought gripped Gaius with a coldness that slipped beneath his tunic, for he knew too well how Rome both indulged and punished those who sought to trespass the invisible boundaries between desire and power. And he began to imagine the senator in his final hours, perhaps surrounded by candles and shadows, perhaps invoking names not spoken in daylight, until whatever had been summoned or imagined turned on him in a violence that could not be hidden. Lucius urged him not to write of it, at least not yet, but Gaius felt the itch of his stylus against the wax, the compulsion to preserve even the whispers of such stories, because if he did not, then these fleeting moments, half-truths and fears shaped by superstition, would vanish like smoke, and history itself would lose a part of its hidden pulse, the rhythm of a city not only built on law and conquest, but on rumor, intimacy, and dread. So he continued walking, Lucius at his side, and as they passed the temple of Castor and Pollux, he saw a line of petitioners, clutching offerings of fruit bread and small bronze figurines, their eyes lifted with a mixture of fear and hope, and he thought how strange it was that the same hands which clasped lovers in secret or lifted goblets in drunken joy were also so quick to tremble with devotion before the carved faces of gods, as though in the span of a single breath one might slide from indulgence into penitence. The city itself seemed to hold its breath as well, its marble gleaming brighter in the morning sun, but its shadows darker, as though beneath every colonnade and every portico lay a hidden story waiting to be unearthed. And Gaius, though only one man with stylus and tablet, felt once more the immense weight of being its recorder, the witness to lives that flickered like lamps in the night, fragile yet burning with desire, fear, faith, and the inexhaustible will to endure. The sun had long dipped behind the hills that framed the ancient city, and the shadows of the tall columns of the forum stretched across the worn stones like silent witnesses to all that had passed and all that was yet to come. And Gaius found himself once again seated within the dim light of his shop, the faint glow of the small oil lamp at his side illuminating the parchment where his hand, though stiff from long hours of writing, continued to move with steady determination, for he had promised himself that these stories, these fragments of lives and whispers of forgotten nights, would not vanish into silence as so much else had, and his mind wandered back to a tale told to him by an old soldier who had once sat, where Gaius now sat, his scarred hands clutching a cup of sour wine as he recalled with a strange mixture of pride and melancholy the pleasures and cruelties of distant lands that Rome had claimed as her own. The soldier had spoken of Gaul, of wide forests and villages where the people, though conquered, had a freedom in their manner of love that Rome found both shocking and strangely enticing, for there was less pretense and less ritual, and though the Romans called themselves masters of civilization, the Gauls did not separate their feasts from their pleasures, and it was said that in long houses lit by fires, men and women shared food, laughter, and bodies in the same breath, so that the boundaries between desire and survival blurred, and to the soldier it had seemed both barbaric and liberating. Though he admitted that Roman discipline and Roman order always returned him to his home soil, Gaius wrote of this with care, knowing that in such tales one glimpsed not just the practices of others, but the hidden longing of Rome itself. For the Roman heart was ever torn between strict order and the temptation of unbridled freedom, and as his reed pen scratched across the parchment he felt that very conflict echoing in himself. For he too had once lived within the constraints of the law, within the quiet rules of family duty. Yet now, alone with his scrolls and his thoughts, he allowed his mind to drift into places where shame dissolved and only curiosity remained. It was then that he remembered the story of Flavia, a woman of patrician blood, who had grown weary of the endless processions, the carefully arranged marriages, and the heavy gold jewelry that weighed on her arms, more like chains than ornaments, and who in the secrecy of night slipped out from her villa to wander into the Subura, the quarter of Rome where noise never ceased, and where life pulsed with rawness that the noble houses pretended to forget. And there, hidden by the cloak drawn over her head, she entered taverns where soldiers and slaves mingled, and it was in those shadows that she learned what Roman poets often hinted at but dared not name outright, that desire knew no rank, that sweat on the skin of a slave could be as intoxicating as the perfume of a noble, and that the rhythms of bodies did not heed the lines drawn by law. As Gaius penned her story, he felt the stillness of the night deepen, the distant sounds of Rome softening into nothing more than echoes, and he thought how many like Flavia had walked those streets unseen, leaving only fleeting traces, for history recorded the triumphs of generals and the decrees of emperors, but seldom the tremors of passion that stirred beneath the marble surface. Yet those tremors were just as real, just as shaping, and perhaps even more revealing of what it meant to live as a Roman in that sprawling, restless city. He set aside his pen for a moment and rubbed his eyes, then leaned back against the wooden chair, listening to the faint crackle of the lamp flame, and in the darkness behind his closed eyes another story surfaced. One told by a Greek physician who had once visited his shop seeking rare herbs, and who spoke with a knowing smile of the secrets whispered among Roman matrons, that in their private chambers many kept small statues and carved objects, gifts from the East, which were used when their husbands, exhausted by politics or distracted by ambition, failed to visit their beds, and though such things were never displayed, they were passed quietly from hand to hand, as much a part of Roman domestic life as the amphora of oil or the loom in the corner, though no historian would write of them openly. This, Gaius realized, was the essence of what he was trying to preserve, the lives hidden in the shadows, the truths murmured but never shouted, the pulse of Rome not in the clashing of swords but in the private rooms where laughter, sighs, and whispered names carried more power than decrees. And so he returned to his writing with renewed resolve, describing the feel of the Subura streets beneath bare feet, the mingling smells of cooked meat and unwashed bodies, the flicker of torchlight revealing faces flushed with wine, and the sense that in that place every man and woman, no matter their station, could taste for a moment a freedom denied to them in the harsh light of day. Hours passed unnoticed as he wrote, and when the first faint light of dawn crept through the shutters, he found his hand still moving, sketching scenes of gladiators not only in the arena but in private feasts, where victorious men were invited to noble houses and celebrated not just with food and coin, but with more intimate rewards. For the Roman elite, though they pretended disdain, were often drawn to the raw vitality of those who risked death for the amusement of the crowd, and such liaisons, though whispered of, shaped the undercurrents of power and desire more than most dared admit. Gaius dipped his pen again and wrote faster, for he felt the tide of memory and imagination flowing strongly now, each tale leading into the next. And in his words, the Rome of marble and banners transformed into a Rome of secret doors, of veiled meetings, of stolen glances in the baths, of fleeting touches during festivals when the wine flowed too freely. And he knew that though these stories might never be carved into stone, they carried a weight of truth that no monument could contain. And so, as the city stirred awake beyond his shutters, and the sound of footsteps began once more to echo along the Via Sacra, Gaius continued to write, certain that if he filled enough scrolls, if he captured enough of these hidden lives, then perhaps, long after he was gone, someone would read and understand that Rome was not only conquest and empire, but also longing, laughter, and the eternal, unquenchable fire of desire. As the late afternoon sun began to tilt toward the horizon, its golden light spilling across the tiled roofs of Rome like a soft blanket of molten fire, Gaius felt the day's weight shift around him in ways both ordinary and profound. For while the world outside his little shop on the Via Sacra carried on with the usual clamors of trade, gossip, and hurried footsteps of slaves sent on errands, within him a new kind of anticipation stirred, one born from the stories he had set to parchment and the sense that he was now holding in his hands not just ink and memory, but the fragile thread that tied the past to the future. He leaned back on his stool, stretching his fingers that ached from the hours of steady writing, and watched a group of young boys racing by, their shouts echoing against the stone walls, reminding him of his own childhood when Rome had felt both endless and unknowable, its mysteries always just beyond the next archway or forum column. And he thought how strange it was that only now, after decades of living, did he feel he was finally beginning to touch those hidden truths. The parchments stacked beside him were not yet many, but already they carried weight, for each one bore fragments of lives forgotten by the Senate, unspoken in the amphitheaters, and ignored by the marble statues that lined the streets. And Gaius wondered what might happen when someone, perhaps long after his bones were dust enrolled, these scrolls and discovered the whispered tales of lovers, slaves, soldiers, and courtesans that had shaped the Rome he had lived in more honestly than any triumph carved in stone. Outside, the air carried the smell of roasting chestnuts from a nearby vendor's cart, mingled with the sharper scent of whetstone where water dripped from an overflowing aqueduct spout, and as Gaius breathed it in, he realized how these small, ordinary details would also vanish if not captured in words. For the city was alive not only in its emperors and generals, but also in its scents, its shadows, its murmurs at twilight. Just as he dipped his reed pen into the inkwell again, a shadow darkened the doorway, and Gaius looked up to see Marcus returning, the younger man carrying under his arm a bundle of papyrus sheets tied with string, his face lit by that restless curiosity which seemed to drive him always toward one more question, one more discovery, and without waiting to be invited he entered the shop, set down the bundle, and declared that he had found something astonishing in the archives near the Forum. Marcus explained, his voice quick and eager, that among the dusty records he had stumbled across fragments of letters exchanged between two women of senatorial households, letters never meant to survive yet somehow kept by accident of neglect. And these letters revealed not politics nor business, but confessions of intimacy, trust, and longing, the kind of hidden tenderness that the official histories had always ignored. And as Gaius listened, his pulse quickened, for he knew at once that such words were treasures beyond gold. Together they unrolled the fragile sheets, their hands careful as though cradling newborns. And Gaius read aloud the faded ink, words that spoke of secret meetings at twilight, of fingers brushing under the cover of woven cloaks, of fears of discovery and yet of love too strong to be silenced. And the small shop seemed to fall into stillness, as though even the street noises had paused to hear voices resurrected from a century past. For a long moment after he finished reading, neither man spoke, and Gaius felt tears sting the edges of his eyes, not only for the women who had lived and loved under shadows, but also for the simple truth that Rome, for all its grandeur, had always been built upon human hearts, yearning in the same ways across time, and he thought that perhaps his work was not merely about preserving stories, but about reminding anyone who came after that love itself had always been the city's hidden foundation. As the sky outside shifted from gold to deepening violet, Marcus finally broke the silence and suggested they should copy these letters before the papyrus crumbled further, and Gaius agreed, taking up his pen once more, steadying his hand, and beginning to inscribe each line with reverence, for it was not only ink that flowed onto the parchment, but the fragile lifeblood of memory itself. Hour by hour, the city around them darkened, torches being lit along the streets, laughter drifting from taverns, the distant clatter of chariots giving way to the softer shuffle of feet heading home. Yet within the shop, a different kind of light glowed, the quiet fire of words reborn. And Gaius felt that perhaps in this hidden labor he and Marcus were shaping something far more enduring than marble arches or bronze statues, for ink on parchment had the power to carry voices across centuries, whispering truths that empires themselves might forget. And when at last they paused, stretching cramped fingers and rolling up the completed copies, Gaius looked at Marcus with a faint smile and said that perhaps they were not merely chroniclers of Rome but guardians of its secret soul. And Marcus, grinning in that way of his, replied that if so, then they must keep writing until every shadow of the city had been given its voice. The night had grown heavier over Rome, with clouds smothering the pale light of the moon, and the lamps along the Via Sacra burned with a dim orange glow that made the stones glisten, as if the entire street had been polished with oil. And Gaius sat within his shop, surrounded by scrolls stacked like walls around him, the scent of aging papyrus mingling with the faint smoke from the oil lamp that flickered restlessly in the draught that slipped through the cracks of the wooden shutters. And his hand moved slowly across the parchment as he wrote, not just for himself but as though compelled by some unseen hand that urged him to capture the forgotten whispers of Rome's pleasures and hidden vices, for he had begun to sense that these stories he gathered and recorded were not merely recollections of the past, but threads binding him to lives that demanded to be remembered, their laughter, shame, desire, and power weaving themselves into the very ink that stained his fingers. He could hear outside the drunken steps of revelers returning from the Suburra, their laughter breaking into hiccups of song as they stumbled down alleys where shadows leaned like watchful sentinels. And from across the street the faint sound of a woman's lyre floated through the shutters of a domus. Soft notes that carried a kind of sadness that made him pause in his writing, and stare into the dark flame of the lamp, as though he might see within it the faces of those who had lived centuries before. And he remembered the words of an old philosopher he once overheard in the Forum, that history was not made of marble arches or golden inscriptions, but of the secrets carried in the heartbeats of ordinary men and women who dared to live and love in ways that defied the chains of law and custom. His thoughts drifted back to the story of the patrician woman whose affair with her gladiator had risked the wrath of her family, and he imagined her slipping through the corridors of her father's villa, the marble floors cold beneath her bare feet, as she crept to the slave quarters where the gladiator waited, with a body hardened by the brutal drills of the arena yet softened in the warmth of her embrace. And he thought of the way love in Rome often had to disguise itself in shadows, finding its freedom not in the grand feasts of senators or the theaters of poets, but in the stolen moments that lay hidden between stone walls and whispered promises. The scratching of his stylus slowed as his mind wandered into visions of the brothels near the Circus Maximus, places painted with crude but vibrant frescoes that showed lovers locked in every imaginable pose, rooms where incense struggled to mask the musk of bodies, and the laughter of sailors mingled with the sighs of courtesans who knew how to weave not just physical pleasure but the illusion of intimacy, selling moments of warmth to men who would leave at dawn to chase profit across the seas. And Gaius wondered whether these women, so often dismissed by the respectable citizens of Rome, carried within them more truth about love than all the stern matrons who lectured their daughters on virtue. The lamp sputtered suddenly, a drop of oil burning too quickly, and the shop was filled for a moment with darkness that pressed heavily upon him until he relit the flame, and in that sudden hush he thought he heard voices whispering around him, as though the ghosts of Rome's lovers stirred restlessly within the very scrolls he had gathered, urging him to continue, to not let their passions die unspoken. And he shivered though the air was warm, because he felt that what he was writing had ceased to be mere record and had become a bridge through which the long dead reached out to the living, their desires as alive as when their bodies had burned on funeral pyres or crumbled into the soil of forgotten fields. And so his hand moved again, tireless though his eyes ached, recording the tale of a soldier returning from the frontiers who had found his wife not waiting as a dutiful spouse, but sharing her bed with a poet who had sung verses to her beauty beneath the olive trees. And though the soldier's rage could have spilled into blood, he instead listened to the poet's words and found himself disarmed by the rawness of his own absence, realizing that war had taken more from him than wounds it had stolen years that might have been filled with touch, laughter, and warmth. And so he forgave, though he could never forget living in the strange balance between loyalty and betrayal that only Rome seemed to produce in endless measure. The hours passed unnoticed until the first pale streaks of dawn crept into the sky and the city began to stir. The sound of carts rattling over cobblestones and the cries of bakers selling fresh bread. And Gaius leaned back, his shoulders heavy with weariness, but his soul strangely light, for he knew that the more he wrote, the more he gave voice to what Rome itself seemed to want remembered, not the victories of its legions or the decrees of emperors, but the hidden life of its people who in their search for intimacy, power, and fleeting joy revealed the truest essence of what it meant to live in the shadow of greatness. And as he laid his stylus down for a moment, staring at the heap of scrolls that now seemed like living things breathing softly around him, he whispered to himself that perhaps one day these writings would survive long after his own body had returned to dust, carrying into the distant future the sighs, cries, and laughter of a Rome that was not carved in stone but lived in flesh and desire. And with that thought he closed his eyes, drifting into a sleep filled with the murmurs of lovers long gone who continued to whisper their secrets in the language of eternity. The streets of Berlin felt heavier than ever that morning as you moved along with the press of body. The citizens worn and hollow-eyed, the buildings sagging under the strain of years of bombardment and the atmosphere thick with rumors that the Red Army was closer with every passing hour. And though the propaganda posters still clung to the walls insisting on victory, even the slogans seemed to fade under the weight of defeat. And as you passed the burnt-out tram stop, you thought about how strange it was that only months ago this city still pulsed with the illusion of control, but now every face you saw carried the shadow of resignation, and you, still an outsider in disguise, felt the pulse of history quickening around you, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. You walked past a bakery with no bread, only the smell of burnt wood lingering in the air, and past the shuttered windows of shops that had once displayed abundance but now showed only scraps of paper and dust. And as the cold wind carried with it the distant rumble of artillery, you couldn't help but imagine what it must have felt like for ordinary Berliners to hear that sound daily, the thudding heartbeat of destruction moving ever closer. And you realized at the end was not a single day, not a single surrender, but a long suffocation in which life drained away piece by piece, until only silence and rubble remained, and you felt yourself trapped in that suffocation with them. At a narrow intersection you saw a cluster of Hitler youth marching, their faces too young and their steps too proud, carrying wooden rifles and chanting slogans with voices that cracked with adolescence. And the crowd parted not out of admiration but out of pity and quiet fear, for these boys were being sent to fight tanks with desperation as their shield, and you wondered how many of them would survive the coming week. And in that moment the strange duality of the war struck you again, how the grand speeches and the monstrous ambitions collapsed into the fragile bodies of children being thrown like kindling into a fire that could not be stopped. And you thought how history would remember them not as warriors, but as victims of an empire-esque delusion. You turned into a side street, the cobblestones slick with the morning frost, and slipped into the building that had once been a hotel, but now functioned as a temporary communications hub for those still pretending that the Reich could coordinate itself. And inside the walls smelled of damp paper and kerosene, the hallways echoing with hurried steps and whispered orders. And when you passed into the lobby, you saw officers hunched over maps with circles drawn in red ink that shrank with each day, their cigarettes burning down to ash as fast as their plans collapsed. And you kept your head down, a silent observer pretending to belong, your forged documents pressed against your chest like a second heartbeat. In the corner of the room, a tall officer barked about reinforcements that would never come, and another whispered about betrayal, and still another spoke with feverish eyes about miracle weapons, and you realized you were watching the unraveling of belief itself, a desperate clinging to myths that could not hold against the weight of steel and fire. And you thought how strange it was that human beings could convince themselves of invincibility even while their cities burned around them, and you wondered if you too in another time would have clung to a doomed cause rather than accept the unbearable truth of collapse. Later, as the day wore on, you found yourself standing near the Tiergarten, the once proud part now scarred with trenches and anti-aircraft guns that pointed uselessly toward skies already dominated by enemy planes. And the trees were broken and splintered, their trunks blackened, and the paths were littered with shrapnel. And as you walked, you could almost see ghosts of families that once strolled here in peace. Lovers who once whispered beneath the trees, children who once laughed and ran, and the contrast was so sharp that you felt the ache in your chest, as though you carried all their lost joy within you, and you thought about how war steals not just lives, but memories, erasing laughter from the spaces where it once lived. A group of women passed by carrying buckets of water from a nearby pump, their faces grey with exhaustion, their clothes patched and worn, and one of them clutched the hand of a child who stared at you with wide, unblinking eyes that seemed too old for such a small face. And for a fleeting second you felt seen, as if the child understood that you were not entirely part of this city, that you were an intruder from another time or another life. And the weight of that gaze followed you long after they disappeared into the ruins. Night descended with a heaviness that pressed down on your lungs. The blackout curtains pulled tight, though the flicker of distant fires lit the horizon with an orange glow. And as you made your way through the darkened streets, you could hear the faint strains of music drifting from a basement, a gramophone scratching out a waltz that seemed too fragile for the world above. And for a moment you paused, standing in the cold, listening to the echo of beauty still trying to exist amid the ruins. And you thought about how defiant that was, how even as the city crumbled, people sought moments of grace, and you wondered if perhaps that defiance was the true survival, not the guns or the speeches or the crumbling empire, but the insistence on music and memory in the face of annihilation. You spent the night in a makeshift shelter, the walls trembling with each distant bombardment, the air stale with the smell of damp coats and sweat, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. And though no one spoke to you, their silence carried 1,000 unspoken fears, and you lay awake listening to the breathing of strangers, wondering which of them would live to see another dawn. And as the ground shook again, you felt time slip strangely, as though the hours were stretching and collapsing all at once. And you thought about how fragile the thread of existence really was, and how terrifyingly easy it was for an entire world to unravel. The next morning, when you stepped back into the daylight, the city felt even more hollow, the artillery louder, the people quieter, and as you crossed the square you saw a man on his knees scrubbing chalk words from the pavement, words that had declared the end is near, and though he erased them with water and rag, the truth of them hung in the air, undeniable, and you realized you were walking not just through a city, but through the very end of an illusion, and every step carried you deeper into the heart of a world that was dying before your eyes. The night was heavy and the air inside the shelter was damp, carrying with it the smell of cold dust and wet earth. And as you sat against the cold wall with your knees pulled close to your chest, the rumbling above was muffled but constant, like some distant giant dragging chains through the city. And you realized that hours had passed since the last meal, yet no one seemed to notice, because hunger was nothing compared to the fear of the next whistle that would tear the night apart, sending everyone into silence and prayer. And so you stared at the flickering lantern shadows, as if they were whispers from another world, one where daylight was free and not rationed out in broken intervals of smoke and fire. You closed your eyes but could not escape the memory of the streets above, the tram lines twisted like broken ribs, the shattered windows reflecting moonlight like shards of ice, and the piles of brick that were once doorways to laughter and bread, now nothing but dust under the boots of soldiers. And though you wanted to believe that morning would bring calm, you knew in your bones that morning had become just another word, because war had stretched the hours until time itself felt wounded, staggering forward without rhythm, and all of you waiting, breath by breath, for it to end. Across from you, an old woman whispered a lullaby to a child who had long fallen asleep, his small hands still clutching a wooden toy horse with one leg missing. And in her voice there was both sorrow and defiance, a melody that seemed older than the rubble and perhaps older than war itself, and you wondered if the child even in dreams could hear the sound of the bombs and weave them into some monstrous fairy tale, where dragons roared across the sky instead of planes and fire fell not as destruction but as a test for heroes. And in that moment you envied him, because children could still transform terror into story, while adults had only memory, sharp and merciless, to guide them through the dark. A soldier entered the shelter, his uniform smudged with ash and his helmet tilted low, and all eyes turned toward him, not because he was an officer, but because he carried news, and in wartime, news was as precious as bread. So he stood there breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling like a bellows, before finally speaking of the Eastern Front, of villages swallowed whole by flame, of rivers running with oil and smoke, of retreats disguised as strategies. And though he tried to steady his voice, there was a crack in it, the kind of crack that spread like lightning through the crowd. And you saw men lower their gazes, women grip their children tighter, and someone whisper a prayer under their breath that ended before it began. The soldier's words lingered even after he left, bouncing off the stone walls like echoes trapped in a cavern. And it was then you noticed that the boy with the toy horse had opened his eyes, wide and shining. And he whispered to you that he dreamed of riding that horse out of the city, across green fields untouched by war. And though you wanted to smile and tell him such dreams could come true, your mouth was dry. And instead you reached into your coat pocket and gave him a small crust of bread, harder than stone but warm in his hands. And he held it as though it were treasure, as though kindness itself had weight. When dawn finally crept through the cracks in the shelter door, pale and uncertain, the people rose slowly, like shadows dissolving back into the world, and you walked with them up the narrow steps, your heart heavy, your legs weak, and when the door opened the morning air struck your face with a chill that carried both smoke and dew. And you stepped onto the street where silence ruled, broken only by the creak of timber and the distant bark of a dog, and you looked at the city as though it were both graveyard and battlefield, alive yet broken, breathing yet bleeding, and you could not tell which part of it belonged to the living and which to the dead. As you wandered down the road you came upon a building that had once been a bakery, its sign hanging by a single nail, the smell of burnt flour still clinging to the walls, and for a moment you imagined the warmth of fresh loaves stacked high, the chatter of neighbors waiting in line, but then the image shattered like glass, and all that remained was ash. And you realized that memory itself could be cruel, for it offered sweetness only to take it away again, leaving you thirstier than before. And so you pressed on, each step sinking into the dust of what once was home. On the corner you found a group of men huddled around a cart, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow, and they spoke of rumors that the war would soon shift, that the invaders were faltering, that perhaps liberation was no longer just a dream. And though their voices carried hope, you could taste the fragility in their words, like thin glass ready to break, and you wondered how many more mornings the city could endure, how many more nights beneath the ground before the spirit itself began to crumble. And you realized that survival was not simply a matter of breath, but of belief, and once belief was lost, no wall, no shelter, no ration could save a soul. The day stretched forward, endless, and you found yourself drawn toward the river where bridges lay in ruins, their arches bent like broken backs, and you stood by the water's edge, watching the current carry pieces of wood, pages of books, even shoes, all drifting toward some unseen horizon. And it struck you that the river was the only thing that moved freely now, the only thing that did not ask permission from the war. And you thought perhaps there was a lesson in that, that even in chains the current of time still ran, and maybe, just maybe, it carried with it the promise that this too would pass, that even destruction was not eternal, though to believe it required strength you were not sure you still had. And so the night approached again, heavy and relentless, and as you turned back toward the shelter you knew that tomorrow would look no different than today. Yet you also knew that as long as people still shared crumbs of bread, still whispered lullabies, still dreamed of horses running through green fields, then something stronger than war remained, something unseen but unbroken. And though you could not name it, you felt it in your chest like a faint but steady drumbeat, carrying you forward, step by step, into whatever dawn awaited. As the smoke of burning timbers and the cries of scattered soldiers slowly faded into the heavy night air, you found yourself standing among the ruins of what had once been a bustling outpost, the ground littered with the wreckage of collapsed walls and twisted iron, and although the silence was punctuated only by the distant rumble of artillery, it felt as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next strike, waiting for the next moment when the fragile illusion of stillness would be torn apart once more. You moved carefully through the devastation, your boots crunching over shards of glass and fragments of charred wood, and you realized that while bodies lay sprawled in broken poses across the dirt, their faces locked in that eternal expression of shock, there were others still breathing, clinging desperately to life, reaching out with bloodied hands that trembled as they begged for water, for help, for mercy. And you knew that in this moment there was no choice but to step forward, to kneel, to share whatever strength you still carried with you. A wounded soldier grabbed your wrist, his eyes wide and filled with a mixture of terror and gratitude, whispering words you could barely understand, fragments of his native tongue that pleaded for his family, for his survival, for someone to tell his story if he could not. And though you could not answer in his language, the simple gesture of holding his hand, of nodding slowly and promising silently, was enough to bring a faint, fleeting calm to his shattered spirit. The night deepened, and somewhere beyond the blackened tree line came the faint sound of marching boots, the low hum of engines straining against the mud, and you knew that the enemy was drawing nearer, their shadows stretching long across the ruined landscape, preparing to reclaim what they had lost, to stamp out the flicker of resistance that still lingered here. And so you forced yourself to rise, to gather the injured who could still walk, to lead them stumbling into the cover of the woods, where perhaps there was a chance, however slim, to survive until dawn. Branches clawed at your clothing, the underbrush whispered against your legs, and the deeper you went, the more the forest seemed to swallow you whole. Its darkness so complete that you could only feel the presence of those who followed by the faint shuffles and labored breaths behind you. Each sound a reminder that you were not alone, that your choices now carried the weight of every life tethered to your path. At last you reached a clearing where the moonlight broke through the canopy, casting a pale silver glow across the ground, and here you paused, lowering the weakest to rest against the roots of a great oak, listening to the steady drip of dew from the branches above as you searched for the courage to plan your next move, to decide whether to press further into the wilderness or risk circling back to find hidden roads and safer passage. The silence here was almost too heavy for beneath its stillness. You could hear the faint echoes of distant cries, the grinding clatter of tanks, dragging their heavy bodies across the countryside, and you realized that though you had escaped the immediate jaws of death, you had only entered the long shadow of pursuit, and survival would demand not only strength but cunning, patience, and the unyielding refusal to surrender even when the odds pressed hard against your spirit. One of the soldiers, his face streaked with grime and his uniform torn to ribbons, pulled from his pocket a small photograph, edges frayed, colors faded, and he pressed it into your palm, his cracked voice breaking as he whispered that this was his home, his wife, his child, that he must return to them. And though you did not know if he ever would, you slipped the photograph back into his trembling hands and told him softly but firmly that he must keep it close, or hope was the only weapon that could not be stripped away. The night stretched on, heavy and unrelenting, and as you leaned against the rough bark of the oak, your eyes heavy but your mind sharp with fear, you realized that tomorrow would bring new battles, new choices, new sacrifices, and though the future was uncertain, one truth rang clear within your weary soul, that as long as you could still draw breath, you would not allow the fire of resistance, the fragile ember of survival, to be extinguished. Not here, not now, not while the world still waited for a dawn beyond war. You awoke once again to the strange stillness that often came after chaos, your body pressed against the cold ground of the abandoned farmhouse where you had taken shelter with the small group of partisans. The faint scent of gunpowder and damp wood still hanging in the air from the previous night's skirmish, and as you sat up slowly you could hear the muffled breathing of the men and women around you, some curled tightly in ragged blankets, others lying with rifles cradled close to their chests, as if even in their sleep they feared the sudden crash of boots and the echo of shouted German commands. And as your eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the broken shutters, you realized with a heaviness in your chest that each new day brought both the possibility of survival and the shadow of discovery. The leader of the group, an older man with a deep scar across his cheek, who had once been a schoolteacher before the war, stripped away books and replaced them with bullets, stirred from his corner and whispered to you that today would not be like the others, that the Germans were pressing harder in the nearby villages, and that intelligence from another cell suggested an armored patrol would soon sweep the area, which meant it was time to move, time to abandon yet another fragile sanctuary and carry the weight of resistance deeper into the forests where winter had begun to creep silently into the bones of everyone who dared to linger too long without fire or food. And you could see in his eyes that tired acceptance of endless flight mixed with the stubborn ember of defiance that refused to be extinguished. So you rose and followed the quiet exodus from the farmhouse, stepping over broken beams and shattered tiles, your breath misting in the cold dawn air as the group made its way along narrow paths trodden more by deer than men, the crunch of frost beneath worn boots sounding far too loud against the hush of the woods. And though you tried to steady your mind, every snapping twig sent your heart lurching in fear that somewhere just beyond the veil of trees a German soldier waited with finger already tightening on the trigger. Hours passed in that relentless march, your shoulders aching beneath the crude pack of scavenged supplies, until at last the forest thinned and the scarred man motioned for everyone to crouch low, pointing toward the distant valley where smoke rose in twisting plumes from chimneys and where, across fields pocked with frozen mud, you could just make out the gray-green figures of German troops moving between farmhouses as though the land belonged entirely to them now. And you realized this was no ordinary patrol but rather an occupation tightening its grip, a kind of slow suffocation that crushed not only resistance fighters, but also ordinary families who simply wanted bread, warmth, and peace. The decision was whispered quickly, voices strained and urgent, that the group would attempt to reach a small railway junction further north where sabotage could delay supply lines. For even a single derailed train could mean hundreds of starving soldiers at the front and one less weapon turned upon innocents. But to reach it meant crossing that valley, slipping between watchful eyes and the roar of engines. And suddenly the enormity of what you had stepped into weighed down upon you. Because this was no longer about hiding or surviving. This was about striking blows in a war where every action was measured against the possibility of death. As dusk fell and the bitter cold sharpened, you crept with the others through ditches lined with brittle grass, the distant clank of tank treads echoing like thunder across the still night. And when you pressed your cheek into the freezing soil to avoid the sweeping beam of a German searchlight, you could hear your own pulse hammering in your ears, louder than the engines, louder than the barking dogs, louder than anything except the thought that if you moved an inch too soon, if you made the wrong sound, there would be no more tomorrows, no more choices, only the sudden violence of discovery. But somehow you crossed each moment stretched into eternity, and when at last the forest swallowed you again on the far side of the valley, there was a collective exhale, quiet but filled with the relief of the condemned, who had been granted a few more breaths. And though hunger gnawed at your belly and exhaustion clung to your limbs, you pressed on through the night until the faint outlines of railway tracks gleamed under a rising moon, thin silver threads that carried the lifeblood of the enemy's war machine. The scarred man explained with hushed precision how the charges must be laid, how timing was everything, how even one mistake could mean disaster. And as you knelt beside him threading wires with trembling fingers, you could not help but think of how strange life had become. That only weeks ago you had measured days and hours of work and rest of meals and conversations, but now you measured life by heartbeats, by the silence between patrols, by the fragile seconds it took to plant a bomb and vanish into the night. When the explosion came, it was not the thunder you expected, but rather a low, rolling roar that shook the earth and sent a fiery plume into the sky. The sound of metal twisting and screaming as a train carrying fuel and ammunition collapsed into mangled ruin. And for one brief, fleeting moment, as the night lit up with flames, you felt the surge of victory. The knowledge that, in this vast and merciless war, you had struck a blow, however small, that would ripple outward into the machinery of conquest. Yet even as the fire burned and the sky blazed orange against the dark, the retaliation began, and the forest erupted with shouts, gunfire, and the piercing wail of sirens, for the Germans would not let this insult go unanswered. And you ran with the others, your lungs searing, your legs trembling, the night alive with death chasing at your heels, until you stumbled down into a ravine where icy water bit at your skin, and the group huddled together panting and shivering, waiting in the hope that the storm of fury would pass over without crushing them beneath its weight. And there, in the freezing dark, as the flames of the wrecked train painted the horizon with fire and the echoes of gunshots cracked through the trees, you realized that this war would never again let you rest easily, that once you had chosen to stand, to resist, to fight, you had become part of a struggle that demanded everything and promised nothing. And yet, despite the fear, despite the exhaustion, a strange certainty settled over you. The knowledge that, even if death came tomorrow or the day after, you were no longer a spectator lost in time, but a participant shaping history with every desperate step. As the camp settled into a rare hush after days of marching and chaos, you found yourself drawn to the edge of the abandoned farmhouse where the unit had stopped for the night, the beams creaking faintly in the autumn wind and the smell of damp hay clinging to the air as if nature itself was reluctant to let go of the past. And while some of the men had already rolled themselves into thin blankets on the cold ground, others whispered by the dwindling fire about rations, about home, about whether tomorrow would bring survival or silence. Yet in that moment you lingered at the threshold with a heaviness in your chest that was part fatigue and part memory. It was in these stolen fragments of quiet that your mind betrayed you, carrying you back to the streets you once knew. Two faces that were now only smudges of warmth and color, to the kitchen table where laughter used to rise like steam from a kettle, and you realized with a sharp ache that war had not only scattered lives across trenches and battlefields, but had also blurred the outlines of peace itself until you could hardly recall what it looked like, as though the world before the uniforms and commands had been a dream. A moth fluttered against the dim lantern near the doorway, its wings tapping a frantic rhythm that reminded you of distant gunfire, and you turned your head away, closing your eyes to block out the sound that wasn't really there. But the body doesn't forget what the mind tries to hide. And so even in stillness, your bones echoed with the percussion of survival, with the deep and endless beat of war's march. Somewhere deeper in the farmhouse, the soft wheeze of a sleeping comrade rose and fell like a broken bellows, and the sound struck you as more human, more fragile, than any rallying cry you had heard on the fields, because here, in the shadows, stripped of uniforms and ranks, each man was only a boy again, curled against the night, praying in silence that morning would not forget to bring him back. You lowered yourself onto a broken stool, your fingers brushing the scarred wood, and in that moment you wondered how many hands had rested here before yours, farmers perhaps, or children sneaking bread, and it felt almost obscene that war had intruded into their home too, stamping its boots over their thresholds, stealing the air that once belonged to peace. And you thought perhaps that was war's truest cruelty, that it claimed not only bodies but places, memories, futures. The wind shifted and brought with it the faint scent of earth and smoke, and your stomach tightened, not in hunger but in recognition, because every battlefield had the same perfume no matter where you stood, the mingling of soil and fire and fear, and as you inhaled it tonight you knew you were carrying it with you, pressed deep into your skin, as indelible as ink. You tilted your head back toward the rafters, where cobwebs clung like fragile banners of another time, and you tried to imagine them untouched, a sign of stillness rather than neglect. And in that imagining you felt the smallest ember of longing for a world where webs were the only threads stretched across beams, where silence was natural rather than ominous, where your eyes could close without flinching at shadows. The night had grown long and heavy with the weight of everything that had passed since the morning Gaius first awoke in this impossible world. And as he sat now in the silence of the camp by the river's edge with the remnants of the soldiers' fire fading to embers, he felt that he was approaching the conclusion of something immense, as though the very air whispered to him that his journey through this dreamlike reawakening of Rome was nearing its end. Yet still there remained one more great turn of the story to be lived, before final rest could claim him, and he could see it in the way the soldiers stared uneasily toward the distant hills where flickers of torchlight moved like phantom serpents, in the way Claudia's hand trembled against his sleeve as though she sensed an ending close at hand, and in the way his own heart beat with the weary rhythm of a man who had carried too many stories, too many faces, too many centuries inside his soul. The torches on the ridge were not friendly. They moved with the discipline of men in formation, soldiers who were not part of the camp, and soon the whispers passed through the legion like a chill wind that another Roman force was descending, one not loyal to them but perhaps to the rival who still lingered in shadow, the man with ambitions as vast as Rome itself, and though no one named him aloud, Gaius knew in his bones it could only be Marcus Severus, that tireless wolf who had pursued him across time and place, seeking the scrolls and secrets that had been entrusted to him, seeking the power that lay within the forgotten knowledge of ancient days. And now the final confrontation was drawing close, not in the Senate, not in the quiet streets of the city, but here on the uncertain edge of wilderness and history, as the soldiers braced themselves for battle, tightening their belts and whispering prayers to Mars, Fortuna, and their household gods. Gaius rose with a heaviness that came not from age but from the strange burden of being a vessel for memory itself, and he walked to the river's edge where the moonlight struck the water in a silver gleam, and he whispered into the ripples the names of those whose stories he had carried, of the gladiator who had fought not for fame but for his daughter's freedom, of the courtesan who had loved fiercely and vanished, without a trace of the senator's wife who had hidden her forbidden desires in marble chambers, of the countless lives of Rome, whose whispers had filled his ears through these long winding nights, and he felt them gather around him like unseen companions, ready to walk with him into this last trial. The clash began suddenly, not with the roar of trumpets but with the hiss of arrows cutting through the dark, and the camp erupted into chaos as shields were lifted, torches overturned, and the ground shook beneath the charge of men who carried the same eagle standards as the defenders. Romans against Romans in a terrible mirror, brother against brother beneath the same gods. And Gaius realized with a sick twist of fate that Rome's greatest enemy had always been Rome itself, tearing at its own flesh in endless hunger for power. Claudia pulled him toward cover, but he resisted, his eyes fixed on the shadowed figure at the center of the opposing line, a man on horseback whose armor gleamed with stolen brilliance, and though the distance blurred details, Gaius knew it was Severus, the rival who believed himself destined to rewrite history, the man who had chosen ambition over memory. And their eyes met across the torchlit battlefield with the weight of inevitability pressing down like iron chains. The fighting swelled, metal against metal, screams tearing through the night, but Gaius moved forward with a strange calm, as though each step carried him not toward death, but toward the culmination of everything. He had been sent here to remember, and he thought of the shop on the Via Sacra, of the ink stains on his fingers, of the quiet act of writing stories no one wished to hear, and how those words had somehow become weapons sharper than any gladius. And as Severus dismounted and strode toward him with sword drawn, Gaius felt that the true battle was not of steel but of memory, of who would hold the story of Rome when all else crumbled to dust. Severus spoke in a voice like thunder, accusing Gaius of weakness, of clinging to ghosts, of failing to seize the destiny that lay open before him, and he promised that with the knowledge hidden in the scrolls, he would forge a Rome eternal, a Rome of conquest and domination, where memory served only power, and for a heartbeat Gaius saw the seduction of it, the promise of empire unending. But then he remembered the faces, the voices, the laughter and tears of the countless forgotten souls, and he understood that Rome was not stone or steel or dominion, but people, fragile and fleeting, whose stories must be preserved or else all greatness was nothing but ash. Their blades met beneath the fading stars, sparks flying as though the heavens themselves were witnesses. And though Gaius had never been a soldier, each strike carried the weight of centuries, each parry the strength of memory itself, and Severus pressed him hard, fueled by ambition, by rage, by the desperate hunger of a man who could not accept mortality, until at last Gaius stumbled, and Severus' blade was poised above his chest. But then Claudia's voice cut through the chaos, not in fear but in defiance, shouting the names of those forgotten souls that Gaius had carried. And the legionaries nearest her took up the call, and suddenly the battlefield echoed not with curses or commands, but with the whispered litany of lives once lost, and Severus faltered, for the sound of memory was a weight he could not silence. Seizing the moment, Gaius struck not with steel, but with the words he had carried, speaking aloud the truth that Rome could never belong to one man, that empire without memory was nothing but tyranny, and Severus' rage broke against that truth like a wave against stone, his sword falling from his hand as though stripped of power, and the soldiers who had followed him stood uncertain, their torches flickering, their faith crumbling as the echo of forgotten lives filled the night air. When Severus fell to his knees, defeated not by the edge of a blade but by the unbearable weight of memory itself, Gaius felt the world shift around him, as though the dream that had held him in this place was loosening its grip, and the soldiers of both sides slowly lowered their weapons, realizing that they had been fighting not for Rome but for the shadow of one man's ambition, and in that realization a fragile peace settled over the field, thin as the first light of dawn. Gaius stood among them, trembling, not victorious, but emptied, as though he had poured out the last of his strength. And Claudia held him upright with tears shining in her eyes, and he whispered to her that one more story remained, the final story that would bind all the others, and then he would be free. And she nodded, though her heart broke at the thought, for she knew the dream was ending, and soon Gaius would return to the silence from which he had come. And so, as the sun's first rays touched the battlefield, washing away the night and revealing the scars of men and earth alike, Gaius gathered the fragments of parchment he had carried, the scrolls inked with memory, and he prepared to write the last chapter, the chapter that would hold not only the lives of the forgotten, but the lesson of this final night. And as his hand trembled over the parchment, he looked once more to the sky, where the fading stars seemed to whisper that the end was near. Yet even as his ink touched the page, Gaius felt a strange calm, for he understood, now that endings were not truly endings, only transitions that memory carried forward like flame passed from torch to torch, and that though he would fade, the stories would not, for they had already been spoken already, taken root in the hearts of those who had heard, and in that certainty he knew that when the final silence came he would not be forgotten. And with that, the penultimate night of his long journey closed, leaving only one last chapter to be written. And as the dawn of liberation settled upon the world, you found yourself walking slowly through the streets of a city that had once known the thunder of bombs and the cries of fear, but now echoed only with the tentative steps of people learning to live again, their eyes tired yet shimmering with hope as sunlight spread across the broken walls like a promise that the wounds of the past would, in time, begin to heal. And in that silence you felt the weight of the journey you had walked, the nights of hunger, the fire of battles, the cold of trenches, the fleeting warmth of companionship, the aching losses that had carved themselves into your soul, and above all the resilience that had carried you through the long shadow of war into the fragile light of peace. You wandered past faces both familiar and strange, and though each carried their own scars, there was in them a quiet strength, a shared recognition that the suffering endured was not for nothing, that even if the cost could never be measured in mere words, The survival itself was a defiance against despair, and you realized that history was not only written in victories or in treaties signed in gilded halls, but in the countless small acts of endurance and kindness that ordinary men and women offered one another when the world threatened to fall apart. And in this realization you felt both humbled and at peace. And when you reached the place where your journey had first begun, the simple street that had once felt like an ordinary thread in the vast fabric of life, you stood still, listening to the echoes of laughter long gone, of footsteps marching, of cries in the night. And you knew that, though the world had changed forever, a part of you would always carry these memories, not as chains, but as lessons, reminders that even in the darkest hour, the faintest spark of humanity can guide us forward, and that survival is not only about enduring, but about remembering, about telling the story so it will not fade into silence. So you closed your eyes, letting the weight of those years rest upon you one last time, and when you opened them again, it was as if the world breathed anew, a world scarred but still alive, a world waiting to be rebuilt, and with a quiet step forward you joined it, carrying in your heart the truth that though you had walked through war, through hunger, through loss, and through fear, you had also walked through love, through courage, through endurance, and through hope, and that is what would remain. And now, dear listener, as this long journey comes to its end, I invite you to breathe deeply, to feel the stillness of this moment, and to let your mind settle into calm, for the story of waking in World War II has been told, and though the echoes of its lessons will always linger, for now you can rest, knowing you have walked through history and returned, safe, whole, and at peace. Thank you for walking this path, and may sleep take you gently now, carrying you not into the noise of war, but into the quiet of dreams, where peace is everlasting and dawn always arrives.